Chapter 15 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. If We Only Hadn't. The group of young people, intent upon paying a visit to the gypsy camp, had gone gaily on their way, not without misgivings on the part of some, in regard to those ponies, whose reputation for gentleness was none of the best. Had Neelie Saunders been of the company, I do not think they would have started, for the ponies belonged to her father, and Neelie knew very well that neither she nor her sister were allowed to drive them. Ned Saunders, a young fellow of 17, was the driver, but he had gone after apples. On the way down the hill they discussed the situation. "We can't hitch up the ponies, Margaret. I can't, I'm sure, and I don't believe you can." "No more I can, Goosie, but the boy who was left in charge of them can." "Oh, so he can, and drive us too. I never thought of that." "He is not going to drive us. I propose to do the driving myself. I just ached to get hold of the reins coming out. That Ned Saunders is a dreadfully stupid driver. I shall make those ponies go like the wind, see if I don't." "Oh, Margaret," said Anna Woodruff, "are you sure you know how to drive?" "Why, of course I know how to drive. The idea! Don't I drive my father's elegant span of bay horses? The handsomest turnout at the park, everybody said. If you are afraid, Anna Woodruff, you might run back and stay with the servant." But Anna, although she was afraid, was not to be ridiculed into turning back. She had insisted upon leaving her little sister in a safe place, and considered her duty done. Mr. Saunders's boy, Dick, who had been brought along that he might be left at the foot of the hill to watch the wagon and ponies, had been told simply that he was to obey orders. So when an entire troop of young ladies, who had come out that morning, came down upon him demanding that the ponies be hitched forthwith to the hay wagon, he obeyed, not without a timid inquiry for Ned Saunders. "He is coming by and by," said Margaret Lancaster, as she clambered gaily in. The others followed her swiftly, and they were off. Now, Margaret Lancaster really had no idea that she was doing anything very daring. She had, as she said, often driven her father's beautiful span of matched bays, the pride of his heart, through the park grounds. It is true that her father sat beside her at the time, but what of that? She had done the driving. Moreover, she did not take into consideration the difference in the roads, nor the clumsiness of the hay wagon. That she kept her word and drove fast, every girl in the party will always be ready to testify. Those ponies fairly flew down the steep, rough hill, the hay wagon clattering ominously at their heels, increasing their speed, if Margaret had but known it. Still, she held the reins with firm hand, and they crossed the track in safety and drew up at the gypsy camp. Here they made quick work of it. There proved to be no gypsy in the encampment who cared to tell fortunes, and, after wandering about a few minutes, and admiring the splendid fire and the great kettle swinging on a crane, some one thought of the afternoon express, and begged Margaret to make all speed back before it was due. If she had not been at that moment seized with the desire to look inside a white-covered wagon, and learn how gypsies managed their sleeping accommodations, they might have accomplished it. As it was, they reached the top of the hill just as the express went thundering by. And then those ponies, if they had run before, fairly flew over the ground. To make matters more dangerous, Margaret "lost her head," as the boys say, and, slackening her hold, let the reins lie loose. Then the ponies seemed to think themselves deserted, and ran in good earnest. "Oh, girls!" screamed Margaret, her face pale with fright. "They are running away. I cannot hold them. I can't do anything with them. Oh, oh, we shall all be killed. They will run straight into the river. I cannot turn them." This looked extremely probable. About half a mile below, the road made a sharp bend, and at that point the river bank was almost on a level with it. If Margaret could do nothing with the ponies, what was more likely than that they should dash ahead without regard to the road, and plunge into the river? Then, what but death awaited any of them? For the river at that point was broad and deep. Suddenly Margaret had a thought which she proceeded to carry into execution. "We must jump for our lives," she said, and suiting the action to the word, she threw the reins from her, and, poising for a second on the side of the wagon, gave a spring and a shriek at the same moment, and was gone. The frightened girls huddled together and shrieked with terror and dismay. Only one of them tried to retain her self-control. That was Georgia Lyman. "Don't one of the rest of you dare to jump," she said sternly. "My father has told me again and again, whatever else you do when a horse is running away, never jump. It is almost certain death. If I had been near enough to Margaret, I would have held her fast. Let us all try to get hold of the reins and pull." But alas, Margaret in her terror had flung the reins so far that it was impossible to get hold of them. Every one was so frightened that they did not notice, what was plainly apparent, that the ponies themselves were rather tired of their wild race, and were decidedly slackening their pace. All the girls could think of was that they were nearing the river. Then suddenly one of them gave a different kind of a scream. "Oh, look!" she panted. "The boys!" Sure enough, there were the boys, 8 of them, brave fellows, forming a cordon across the road. Those ponies would need to be skillful to get past them. I believe in my heart that the ponies did not want to pass them, but were, on the contrary, quite willing to be seized by their bridles by 2 such determined fellows as Ned Saunders and Fred Ainsworth. There was a great deal to be done in the next few minutes. 2 of the girls, now that the danger was over, fainted dead away, and had to be thought about. But the most of them thought of poor Margaret. "Who started this wild ride?" Ned Saunders asked sternly. "Oh," said Anna Woodruff, "it was poor Margaret, but don't blame her now, she is, oh dear!" "She is what?" exclaimed Fred Ainsworth, looking up from one of the fainted girls. "Where is she?" Then half a dozen voices told him, and his pale face grew paler, and he gave over trying to revive Carrie Benson, and said, "Then she is dead." "Oh, no, no!" they shrieked. "Don't say that! Oh, don't waste time here! Why don't you go to her?" Though why they should have added that no one knows, for Fred Saunders was already jerking the ponies around, and before the cry about wasting time was concluded, he and Frederick and 3 others of the strongest boys were in the wagon, and the ponies were hurrying up the hill again. People who heard the story, told for days afterwards, exclaimed that it was "just a miracle," and some said it couldn't be possible. But nevertheless it was that Margaret Lancaster was not killed by her wild jump from the hay wagon. She was bumped, she was sprained, she was bruised all over, but she was very much alive. Ned Saunders declared afterwards that, since she was such an idiot as to jump at all, some angel who takes care of idiots must have been there to select the only safe place for her. Just ahead, and just a step backward, were sharp, jutting stones, while the place where she fell was slightly depressed and much shaded, so that the ground was still soft from recent rains. Margaret had fainted at first, but, before the rescue party reached her, she had revived enough to issue some very reassuring groans. "She isn't dead, anyhow," said Ned Saunders cheerfully, "and her lungs are still good, or she couldn't groan like that." Frederick sprang like a cat from the wagon, and had his cousin in his arms before the others could come to help him. 2 of the boys occupied themselves in making a bed in the hay wagon, out of leaves and grasses, covered by their coats. But Ned Saunders was examining the wagon wheels. "Here's a fix," he said in a low tone to one of them. "I noticed that this wagon wobbled dreadfully when we came out. Something has happened to this hind wheel. They must have cracked some of its joints in turning. It won't last for us to get home, that is certain. And I don't hardly feel that it is safe to go back to the Grove Inn, after our things, unless we fellows walk and keep a close watch, and kind of brace it up if necessary, while Fred rides and takes care of Margaret. What we are going to do after that, I'm sure I don't quite see." "I see," said Harold Wood. Let some one take one of the ponies and gallop back to town as fast as possible for an easy rig of some kind for her and the girls. We fellows can walk back." "Good for you," said Ned Saunders approvingly. "That is just what can be done. I've traveled on Frisk's back without any saddle before now, and I can do it again. I'll bring our carriage and a doctor as fast as possible." This program was carried out. Ned Saunders galloped off as soon as possible after the party reached the grove, feeling all the more need for haste because poor Margaret was evidently suffering great pain. She fainted twice on the way back. The others, having made her as comfortable as they knew how, stood, or sat, around in disconsolate groups waiting. Mag, having discovered that all the others were occupied, toiled down the hill with one basket at a time until all but one were near the wagon. Then it suddenly occurred to Frederick to observe her, and to order the boy Dick to go for the basket. "See if you can do so much," he added sternly. "If you had done your duty all this would not have happened. A child might have known that those ponies were not to be entrusted to girls." Mag, relieved of her duties, looked with grave troubled eyes at poor Margaret, whose pale face was drawn with pain, and who gave vent to feeble moans whenever she made the slightest movement. "It's her foot, I think," said Georgia Lyman, in response to Mag's inquiring look. "At least, her foot is hurt. I don't know which part of her hurts the worst, but she can't move that the least bit without fainting." "It ought to be put into hot water," said Mag. "How do you know?" This from Georgia, curiously. "One of the boarders sprained her wrist last winter, and the surgeon made her put it in hot water and keep it there for hours." "That's so," said Frederick, briskly. "I knew that when I was no taller than the table, but I never thought of it. See what it is to have one's knowledge in command. Can one of you boys light a fire and put a big chocolate pot on full of water? That will be better than nothing." "There is a big pan that the cookies and cakes and things were packed in," said Mag. "So there is. That will hold more than the chocolate pot. It takes you to think." It took Mag to do, also. It was she who finally managed the fire, as being the one who apparently understood it best. Mary Lyman was in the wagon trying to take the shoe and stocking from the poor, swollen foot. The latter had to be cut away. And at last, not without much groaning and one downright faint, the foot was placed in a pail of hot water. Then there was really nothing else to be done but watching and replenishing the fire, and waiting. It was astonishing how hard they found it to wait, although they were on the very grounds where they had declared they would like to stay until the moon came up in the evening to light them home. Now they watched the sun with a kind of horror as it went swiftly toward the west. All the joy had gone out of their day, and the utmost desire to each was to get home as soon as possible. "It's queer," said Harold Wood, "what a difference it makes to have one of the party hurt. Ned and I were groaning only a little while ago over his promise to his father to get home before dark. We thought it would be so delicious to have supper up here, and drive home by moonlight. And now it seems as though I wanted to fly home." "If we only hadn't gone," murmured Georgia Lyman. "That's just it. What possessed you to get off in that way without any of us? Ned would have driven you to the gypsy camp, with all his heart, if he had known you wanted to go. What that stupid boy was about to allow it, I can't imagine. I hope he will be discharged for his folly." "I don't," said Georgia, resolved upon bearing her share of the blame. "I don't think he could have helped it. He saw just how determined Margaret was. You know how she is when she makes up her mind to do a thing? And we all helped her. We got into a sort of gale, you know. She was so sure she could drive that we trusted her fully. Why, she said she had driven her father's horses in town, and we thought, if she could do that, she could certainly manage the ponies on a quiet country road." Frederick Ainsworth had come down from his post in the hay wagon, in search of his umbrella to make a canopy over the sufferer's head, and he halted for a moment beside the two. "There is nothing like the exact truth," he said gravely. Margaret never drove her father's thoroughbred horses in her life, unless he or my father were sitting beside her. Perhaps she didn't think that little item made any difference, but I think it does. I've no doubt, though, that she thought she could drive. That is one trouble with her. She thinks she can do anything." "I don't believe she would have been so determined to go," said Georgia, thinking back, "if it had not been for little Mag." Frederick had started to return to the hay wagon, but he turned back at the sound of Mag's name. "What had she to do with it?" he asked. "Why, she begged us not to go. She was sure it wasn't safe, because Mr. Frederick said so, and he knew. There is something about Mr. Frederick's name that seems to set Margaret off. After that she was determined to drive, though some of us were urging that we could all walk there nicely." Frederick Ainsworth walked back to the hay wagon with a thoughtful air. This matter of influence was a strange thing. Could he possibly, in a remote way, be to blame for this accident, which might be more serious than any of them imagined? He knew he was inclined to be arbitrary with his young cousin, to exercise authority over her, especially in the absence of her father and mother. He liked to assume that the 3 years' difference in their ages gave him the right to be authoritative. "Poor little Mag," he said to himself with a sigh. "She is the only one who has a very high opinion of Mr. Frederick. He even has to be ashamed of himself sometimes." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A hard lesson. There is one person who will doubtless never forget her ride home from the picnic. Every step the horses took seemed to cause her pain. Ned Saunders was back with Easy Carriage and the village doctor before even the impatient party who waited had begun to watch for him over the hill. Everything that could be done for Margaret's comfort was thought of, and her aunt, who had come in the carriage, pillowed the poor girl's head on her lap all the long, slow drive home. But at best it was a hard time. The doctor was as cheery as possible before Margaret, told her that she had had first-rate attention already, that the hot water was just the thing for her foot, and that they would soon have her in a place where they could make her more comfortable. But he shook his head in answer to Frederick's questions, and told him that he was afraid there was a long, weary time for the poor girl, and that it was even doubtful whether she would ever jump again. "That knee was bent in an ugly way," he said, "and sometimes these jumps make serious business. However, she is young and strong, and we will hope for the best." The best was a serious trial to Margaret. The hurts all proved to be tedious in their results rather than serious. At least, the city doctor, who was called in consultation, said he hoped the young lady would be as well as ever in a few months. But he might almost as well have said years, so far as Margaret was concerned. She had never been ill for more than 3 days at a time in her life, and the prospect of lying still for months was so utterly hopeless to her that she turned her face away from them all, and, after murmuring that she would much rather have been killed outright, cried herself into a nervous headache. With this for a beginning, it will be easily understood that she did not make a very cheerful patient. Indeed, as the days went by, and their anxiety in regard to her wore off, it began to be very hard for her nurses to listen to her continual fretting. She blamed the doctors, and the roads, and the ponies; the boys for going after apples and leaving them to take care of themselves, and the girls for going with her, and Dick for allowing them to go, and even the gypsies for having been in camp at the time. Frederick Ainsworth considered himself a model nurse because he gave up so much of his vacation to her, and his aunt commended him for patience and forbearance. But there were times when poor Margaret accused him of thinking only of himself. On the whole, there was no one at the boarding-house but earnestly hoped that the sick one would improve very rapidly, and grow able to go back to town, where she longed to be. Of all who had to do with her, the one whose conduct was the most surprising, to those who knew her well, was Mag Jessup. As a matter of course, Mag had occasion to be in Margaret's room very often during the day. It was she who toiled upstairs with the broths and toasts, and cool drinks and warm drinks, and fruits that were in some shape or other nearly always in demand for that room. It was she who sat in the room while Margaret's aunt went down to dinner. It was she who kept the flies from troubling Margaret while the aunt took an afternoon nap. In short, it was she who was called upon for all the extra and many of the regular services demanded by the invalid. She performed every duty with painstaking care. She might have been a wound-up clock, so regularly did she go about the work that became routine. Yet Frederick Ainsworth knew, and Miss Ordway knew, and Margaret's aunt surmised, that the Mag who was attending Margaret was not the same Mag who had been doing errands all summer. There was almost never a smile on her little brown face as she came into the room. She offered no words except those that were absolutely necessary. She stayed not 1 second beyond the time demanded of her by duty. Margaret herself noticed the difference, or at least disapproved of the present Mag. "I would as soon be waited on by a tombstone," she said petulantly one day, when Mag had brought her a glass of water fresh from the spring, had stood silently by while she drank it, and silently retreated from the room the instant the glass was returned to her tray. "I wish there was some one to wait on me who didn't look as though she expected to die because of it. Why can't Jane come up with things, or Kate Perkins for that matter?" "My dear," said her aunt soothingly, "remember that Mrs. Perkins has a large family, and not a great deal of help. Jane has her hands very full. As for Kate Perkins, I suppose she would tell you that she is not hired to wait upon her mother's boarders, though she does come often, you know." "Not very. They are all a selfish set. And it was just as much their fault as mine. If they hadn't wanted to go to that horrid old gypsy camp, I shouldn't have gone. Kate Perkins ought not to feel above waiting on me, I'm sure. If my mother kept boarders for a living, I should expect to do my share of it. Anyway, I wish I could have somebody besides that horrid little Mag." "She is a very solemn-looking little girl, certainly," the aunt admitted, "but she is neat and quiet. I wonder if anything has happened to the child. I used to think she had more life in her." "She had life enough at the picnic," said Margaret. "She chattered and giggled all the time. Fred made an idiot of himself petting her. It was his fault that she went along." "My dear, what harm did it do? The poor child can't have many outings, and she was certainly not to blame for your accident. She was the only one who didn't go with you, was she not?" "Good reason why. She had to stay and take care of the dishes. We were sure she knew how to do that." "But, Margaret dear, didn't she offer? Surely none of you were cruel enough to force the little creature's homeless and dependent position on her by obliging her to stay behind and do the work." Margaret turned irritably on her pillow as she said, "Oh, Aunt Helen, please don't talk about her any more. She is a stupid little owl, and I'm tired of the sound of her name." It was Miss Ordway who broke in upon Mag's established order of things. Her city friends, by the way, had come, a young married lady with her 2 young sisters in charge. More winsome girls than Elise and Elsie Duane would be hard to find. Money had been in plenty, or at least their parents had. Mag Jessup heard the elder portion of the family talk so often about this that she was in danger of getting a very false idea of the importance of wealth. But the girls themselves were as simple and sweet as the wild flowers they delighted in. If they wore elegant dresses in town, as Margaret Lancaster declared that they did, they had left them all behind, and appeared in the morning in the freshest and neatest of percale dresses, while their very best were of white muslin, simply made. Elise was nearly a year older than Mag, and Elsie was quite a year younger, but both of them seemed to find an immediate attraction in the shy, brown little girl who had never been to school and who knew so much less and so much more than most girls her age. They found their way often to the back porch where Mag still sat with her endless fruits and vegetables, and many were the talks the 3 had together. Poor Margaret Lancaster in her upstairs prison would have been sick with envy could she have seen them. for to meet and become intimate friends with the Duane girls had been one of the thoughts that had lately reconciled her to this summer in the country. But I meant to tell you of Miss Ordway and Mag. The little girl came one morning to bring Miss Ordway a fresh pitcher of spring water, and stopped to smell of a sweet pea that had been placed on the canvas the day before. "It seems as though it could be smelled," she said gleefully. "How can there be sweet peas so lovely as that, without being sweet? Oh, Miss Ordway, it is so wonderful to think you can do it. If you could only make them smell, wouldn't it be too beautiful?" "I presume it would," said Miss Ordway, smiling at her enthusiasm. Then she seized the opportunity to ask questions that had been troubling her. "Are there two little Mags in this house, do you think?" Mag looked her surprise. "Oh, no, ma'am," she said. "I know there are not. There is Miss Margaret Lancaster, you know, of course, but nobody ever calls her Mag, and besides that, there is only me." "I don't quite know how to account for it," said Miss Ordway, arranging flowers for her vase, and seeming to not give a great deal of heed to what she was saying. "There is a little Mag who comes to my room with the brightest face. When she brings me water it is always done with a smile, as though she was glad to bring it, and when she sees any of my pretty things her face lights up with pleasure, and altogether she is a very pleasant sight to look at. But occasionally in Miss Margaret's room I find a little girl called Mag, whose face is so very sober that it seems much longer than the face that I know, and as nearly as I can discover, she never laughs in that room, nor says a cheery word. Can she possibly be the same Mag? And if she is, how does she account for the difference?" Mag did not laugh then. Instead, she blushed until her cheeks were as red as the roses Miss Ordway was arranging. It was clear that she did not want to make any answer, but Miss Ordway kept silence and waited. At last Mag said, in a voice that was low and timid, "It is because I love you, Miss Ordway." "That is very nice, I am sure. I like to be loved. But does that mean that you do not love Miss Margaret?" "Yes'm, it does. I don't love her the least bit in the world, and I don't want to say any words to her, only just what I have to. And I haven't got any smiles when I am where she is, and don't want to have." Miss Ordway turned and looked at her curiously. "What a fierce little creature it is, after all," she said, as if thinking aloud. "Who would have supposed it?" Then to Mag, "Little girl, what is the matter? What has poor Margaret done to arouse such wrath? I supposed you would be all melted into pity for her." "I don't pity her," said Mag in severest tone. "She brought it all on herself, and made trouble for everybody, and broke Mr. Saunders's wagon, and lamed one of the ponies, and was hateful and horrid." Miss Ordway could not help laughing. "So you think you must punish her for such selfish and inconsiderate conduct, do you? My child, if Mr. Saunders has forgiven her, one would suppose you might. Don't you know that he has sent her fruit several times, and the most lovely flowers, and has promised to take her out to ride after those same ponies as soon as she is able?" "It isn't that," said Mag, lowering her voice again. "She wasn't at all good to me. I don't think I have any reason to like her, or to try to be pleasant to her." And then Miss Ordway resolved to know what it was all about, and questioned until Mag poured out her tale of woe, as revealed to her by Lora Woodruff. In truth, the lady, after the first revelations were made, had no difficulty in understanding the situation. She had seen enough of Margaret Lancaster to know that she could be very disagreeable when she chose. Still, it was a pity to see a little girl take the follies of another little girl so deeply to heart. What could be said to lessen the effect? Suddenly an idea occurred to the lady. "How do such feelings as those match with your new book?" she said, turning and looking at Mag with a winning smile. "Ma'am?" said Mag, bewildered. "Which book do you mean?" "Why, the Bible. Didn't you tell me something about following the directions in the Bible as soon as you found them out? How do the directions about Margaret Lancaster match your conduct?" "Is there something about Margaret Lancaster in the Bible?" No words will describe the note of astonishment and also of dismay in poor Mag's voice. Despite the undertone of pathos, Miss Ordway could not help smiling. "I'm pretty sure there is," she said positively. "Let me see if I can find it for you." She looked about for her Bible, and blushed a little over the fact that it was nowhere to be seen. Manifestly she did not order her daily life by its teachings. She remembered carrying a pile of books, a few days before, to stow away in a large trunk in her closet. The Bible must have been among them, and she had not missed it. She went down into the depths of the trunk and pulled it out. But now she did not know where to look for the promised words. However, the Bible had a concordance attached, and Mag, leaning over the lady's shoulder, had its mysteries explained to her. By its aid the verse was found and read aloud: "I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven: for he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same?" "Who said that?" exclaimed poor Mag, almost breathless with astonishment and pain. "Who was it talking, Miss Ordway?" "It was the Lord Jesus when he was on earth." "Will you let me look at it?" asked Mag, and she read each word again with painstaking slowness, pausing only to ask one question. "Who are the publicans, Miss Ordway?" "The publicans?" repeated that lady, hesitatingly. "Why, I presume in that connection it means outsiders, people who do not pretend to order their lives by the Bible. It is a very easy matter, you know, to love people who love us, and are good and kind to us. But Jesus wanted his followers to do a great deal more than that." And then, quite to Miss Ordway's relief, Mag was called in peremptory tones by Mrs. Perkins. "In 2 minutes more I should have been beyond my depth," thought Miss Ordway, smiling, as the door closed after Mag. "I wonder what Ward would think to hear me trying to preach a sermon from a Bible text. Poor little mouse! I have given her a hard lesson to learn, one that I couldn't practice myself to save my life. I wonder what she will do with it?" She might well have asked. Never in all her 14 years of life had such a bitter truth been pressed upon Mag's notice. She ignored the history of England entirely, and, finding the words in her own little Bible, read and reread them at every leisure interval until they were burned into her memory. And their meaning grew plain as she studied. She was actually told to love Margaret Lancaster. If it had not been for that word, Mag might have got some comfort. After an hour or two she admitted to her conscience that she could pray for Margaret, and do good to her. In a sense she had been doing good to her all the time. But to love her! That was simply impossible. Yet it said, "that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven." And what did that mean if not that people who refused to obey the orders would not be counted his children? End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After the Storm. That August day, which began by being very bright, clouded over early, and by 10 o'clock a dreary rain was falling. The storm increased in violence until, by the middle of the afternoon, some of Mrs. Perkins's boarders said it was much more like the last of November than the last of August. The wind blew in fierce gusts, and the air had a nip in it that did really remind of November. Just before dark it was announced to Mag Jessup that the fireplace in the great parlor, which had been filled all summer with lovely dried grasses and plumy ferns, was to be cleared out and a fire laid and started. "It is perfect nonsense," said Mrs. Perkins, in caustic tones. "Nobody needs a fire in the parlor, any more than a cat needs 2 tails. But some of them have taken a notion that they do, and that is just as bad as though they did. Trust people who have nothing to do to get up notions that make work for others. They will do it every time." Mag Jessup was rather glad than otherwise that this bit of work had fallen to her. The parlor was full of a dusky, shadowy light made by the fading day. She could see to do her work, and yet the shadows were thickening so fast that no one who might happen to enter the room could see her very plainly, and she felt, this poor little mouse, as though it would not be possible any longer to get along without a quiet cry. Nothing that would hinder her work, nor make disturbance in any way, but just a chance to let the tears chase each other down her cheeks. All day long she had hunted in vain for such a chance. The day had been an unusually busy one, made so by the unexpected storm. Nobody in the large house had the remotest idea where his rubbers had last been left, and, as for umbrellas, the fairies seemed to have hidden them. Several children who had gone to the spring house to play had to be hurried after with wraps and cautions, and Norah, made cross by the upsetting of certain plans of hers, had wanted constant waiting on between times. The twilight and the fireplace were Mag's first helps toward solitude. While she got on her knees to lay the sticks scientifically, she let the tears have it their own way. Her tired little heart felt almost broken. "What is the use, oh, what is the use?" it kept drearily asking of her, and a mean-spirited creature that seemed to have an abode inside her kept muttering that there wasn't any use, she might as well give it all up. She wasn't the Lord's servant any more, and couldn't be. He wouldn't have her unless she would love Margaret Lancaster, and she never could, never. As for being his jewel, that was all a mistake, of course. She had thought she was, she had meant to be, but here was something he said she must do, and she couldn't. And of course he wouldn't have her for a jewel after that. With such words whispered at her all day, was it any wonder that Mag wanted to cry? She laid the fire, however, with utmost care, and swept up the hearth, then looked about for matches. The boarders were already taking supper in the dining room. In a few minutes they would be trooping in, and Mrs. Perkins had told her to be sure to have the fire going well before they came. She struck a match and showed how skillfully she had done her work by the cheerful sputter that began immediately among the kindlings, and the ruddy glow that presently filled the room with light. It showed distinctly the tears that were still slowly traveling down the little girl's cheeks. They were perfectly plain to Fred Ainsworth, who had come in the back way because of his dripping umbrella, and had at the moment stepped into the parlor door to learn what made that sudden light. Then he meant to hurry in to his belated supper. Instead, he went forward into the room. "Halloo!" he said, "what have we here? You don't say you are trying to put that fire out with tears. What a waste of water! Why, everything is soaking outside. If you could just turn it out on the road instead, it would be quenched in 2 seconds." Mag tried to laugh, this was such a funny idea. She had made a hysterical little noise that she meant for a laugh, but it sounded more like a sob. Mr. Frederick came near to her. "What is it, Mag?" he said kindly, in a changed tone. "Something very bad must have happened, I am sure. What can it be?" Whereupon Mag struggled with her tears, and overcame them, and spoke distinctly, though very low. "I can't do it, Mr. Frederick. I've got to give everything up, I suppose, and it makes me feel dreadful. I don't see how I can give up, but yet I must, of course, because I cannot do it." "Nothing was ever clearer," he said, with great gravity. "Let me see if I can repeat it. I can't do it, I've got to give it up. I can't give it up, yet I must because I can't do it. Is that right? It is perfectly plain, I am sure." Then Mag really had to laugh a little, but it was only a very little. In a second she was grave. "I don't know how to tell you," she said mournfully, but by dint of much questioning she succeeded at last. "I begin to comprehend," her listener said. "You consider my cousin Margaret your enemy, and you find that you can't love her, and Miss Ordway has shown you in the Bible that in that case it is all up with you. Is that right?" Mag nodded her head. "It is a bad case," he said gravely. I'll own that I don't think you have any great reason to love my cousin. Still, I don't think she really means to be your enemy." "But she has been mean to me," said Mag, earnestly, "and said mean things about me. You don't know how many, Mr. Frederick. Lora Woodruff told me all about it." "I dare say. I could find something in the Bible about Lora Woodruff, I believe, that it might do her good to see. But about your case, I think you said you were willing to pray for Margaret?" "Oh, yes, sir. I haven't, but I most know I could; and if it was only that, I would try. But there's that word love, Mr. Frederick." "I see. You don't believe in any half measures. Still, if I were you, I should try the praying. I've heard wise people say that when they prayed for persons they didn't like, the feeling they had for them changed sometimes. I don't know anything about it myself, Mag, but I heard a very good woman say that once, one who knew more about the Bible than I should if I lived 100 years." And the young fellow gave a little homesick sigh as the picture of his dear grandmother came vividly before him at that moment, with her serene old face framed in a white cap, an open Bible always on the table by her side. Mag was looking at him intently with very wide open, anxious eyes that presently changed in expression, and seemed full of wondering awe. "I never thought of that," she said slowly. "I thought I must not pray for her, because I did not love her. The love comes first in the verse. But maybe, seeing God knows just how it is, he would help me." "It is worth trying, I assure you," said Mr. Frederick, and now there was a broad smile on his face. All at once the ridiculousness of it came upon him. Miss Ordway and himself trying to explain the Bible and teach Christian duty to this child. "Physician, heal thyself," he repeated, as he went toward the dining room. If the mouse knew enough, she might quote that old proverb to us with relish. But Mag was not thinking of either of them. Her mind was full of a great and solemn thought. God, who knew her much better than Miss Ordway or Mr. Frederick did, knew that she could not make herself love Miss Margaret. And perhaps in his greatness he would find a way to help her if she only asked him. Why had she not thought of this before? I think the angels must have looked that night upon a sight to interest them. A bare little room boarded off by a very thin partition from the larger attic where others of the help slept; a room furnished only by a small cot bed, a pine box turned on its side and its top covered with newspaper, for a washstand, and ornamented with a bright tin basin and a broken-nosed water pitcher, and a three-legged stool for a seat. This was Mag Jessup's room. Beside the cot she knelt, a small figure in a dark blue calico nightgown (Mrs. Perkins made nightgowns out of old colored wrappers, because they showed soil less than white ones. The rain had ceased suddenly, and the moon was struggling with clouds, and occasionally got the better of them and filled the little room with glory; and bathed in it was the little soul that wrestled on her knees with the old problem of how to forgive one who had injured her. She did not know, poor child, how old a story it was. She thought in her ignorance that she was the first person in this great sinful world who had found it hard, even to impossibility, to do right. She did not kneel long. Children's prayers, if perfectly sincere, are always very short. Mag had not many words to say, and when they were said, she waited a minute and said the very same words again, not that she felt it was necessary, but because the repeating of them in some way comforted her. Then she laid herself down on her very short and narrow cot and fell asleep at once, for she had worked hard all day and was tired. She was awakened in the morning by a sound of voices outside her door. She recognized the voices. They were Jane's the chambermaid and the nurse girl, who assisted Margaret Lancaster's aunt in the care of the invalid. "Well, and how is she this morning?" Jane was asking. "She isn't very good, and that's a fact," was the emphatic answer. "She's as cross as two sticks. I don't know as I blame her very much, poor thing. It is awful dull for a young girl like her to be lying there day after day. She ain't used to it, you see. And last night her foot pained her a good deal. She got out of patience with it yesterday and gave it an ugly twitch or two that made her have a hard night. I reckon she'll have a chance to learn patience, though, before she gets through. Have you heard what the doctor told her aunt yesterday?" No, Jane had heard nothing. The voices dropped a little lower, but still Mag could hear distinctly. "Why, don't you think he is afraid her foot will never be just right again. He had over some big words that I guess nobody but himself understood, but they meant that there is some kind of twist to it that they don't often get over. He said she might have to walk with a cane, or she might get so that she wouldn't need a cane, but he was afraid there would always be a limp, and I guess it would about kill her if she knew it, for she looks like a proud piece." They talked longer, but their voices sank to whispers, and Mag made no effort to hear more. She had heard enough. Poor, poor Margaret! Her heart swelled with such a sense of pity as she had never felt for any one before. Those beautiful small feet of which their owner had evidently been so proud, and now to have a twist in one of them that would not get well! Mag hopped up and began the process of washing and dressing in haste. It was still early, but she felt in a great hurry. For what? Her fingers came to a full stop as she asked herself that question and waited for the answer, and realized what it meant. She felt in a hurry to do something for Margaret Lancaster. Something to comfort her, cheer her, help her in some way. Then did she actually love her a little, after all? Oh, never mind, she did not know. Perhaps the name of it was not love, but it was named something different from what she had felt before. She must get downstairs and see if there were any asters in bloom of that queer pale color that Miss Margaret liked so much. Nobody had taken her any, and Mrs. Perkins said she did not care how many were picked, there were going to be shoals of them. She had no time for the asters, after all. Norah called to her and kept her feet running hither and thither, although she knew she was downstairs nearly half an hour earlier than usual. At last came the order to toast a slice of bread for Miss Fussy. That was Norah's name for the invalid. Never was bread more carefully toasted, and the milk to be poured over it was heated to just the point that escaped that disagreeable scum which was occasionally allowed to gather. Then Mag arranged the tray with utmost care, choosing a plate that she felt sure Miss Margaret would like, and a tiny shell-like cup for her cocoa. When all was ready, she asked eagerly, "Norah, may I just fly out to the garden and get an aster or two for it, before I take it up?" "An aster or two!" repeated Norah in fine scorn. "Folks can't eat asters, and by Jane's tell she is cross enough this morning to throw them at your head. But I'm sure I don't care, get 'em if you want to." And Mag brought them, pale and pure and wet with dew. Her face was bright when she entered the upstairs room with her tray. "Good morning," she said cheerily. "I've brought you some lovely toast, and an egg that was laid this very morning for you, and a cup of cream for the toast." "I hate the sight of toast," said Margaret crossly. "Why don't you— Oh, there are asters! I thought I should be downstairs before they were ready. I don't believe I'm ever going downstairs. I believe that hateful old doctor is cheating me, telling me I will be better next week, and all the time he knows that I'm never going to get well." She pushed the tray from her, and burying her face in the pillow, burst into a passion of tears. Oh, poor Margaret! It was the only thought the little attendant had. Every vestige of dislike, or aversion, or indignation had gone out of her heart. She was sorry for Margaret. Yes, and she loved her. How could anybody help it, when she was sick and felt so badly, and had a twist in her foot that perhaps never— And here Mag felt a choking sensation in her throat, and was afraid that she too would cry. This would never do. "Won't you take a swallow of the cocoa while it is nice and hot?" she asked timidly. "And you can't think what is under this saucer. It is a surprise on purpose for you, something that you like, I guess, ever so much." Curiosity presently got the better of tears. Margaret peeped, and found a wonderful cluster of Niagara grapes, the first of the season in that part of the world. Before she knew it, she was pressing great globes of cool sweetness between her lips, and tasting of the cream toast and delicately poached egg, and taking sips of the cocoa; and Mag, eager, alert, patient, was holding the tray at just the right angle, and keeping the napkin ready for the dainty grape-stained fingers, intent on helping Miss Margaret Lancaster to just as good a time as could possibly be secured. Chapter 18 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. What made you change? "Look here," said Fred Ainsworth, detaining Miss Ordway as she was passing through the hall, "who is responsible for the present condition of things, you or I?" Miss Ordway laughed. "What a large question!" she said. "Do you refer to the weather, or the state of the crops, or the fact that vacation is almost over?" "I refer to the small brown child upstairs. It is simply angelic, the way in which she is humoring my cross cousin's most unreasonable whims, and it is but a short time since I found her bathed in tears over the fact that you had shown her that the Bible and her treatment of the said cousin did not agree." "It was not that she did anything very dreadful to poor Margaret," said Miss Ordway, still laughing, "but the little mouse did not try to be cheerful, and quaint, and interesting, as she can be, and I wondered what was the matter. Then I found out that she was nursing a terrible state of things in her poor little heart, so I tried to talk her on a level with her own theories, that was all. I confess that the result is surprising. No angel could have been sweeter or brighter than she has been ever since to Margaret." "She is a very curious little girl," said Frederick, with the air of a man of 30. "I like to study her. I confess that I do not understand her in the least. My cousin Margaret hasn't been especially gracious to her, as I happen to know; and since she has been ill, she hasn't spared any of us, but Mag seems to have risen above it all in a way that is really wonderful in a child. But what amuses me the most is the fact that you and I seem to be responsible for this development; and as, in Mag's opinion, it is altogether in a religious line, the query is, how came we to know so much about it?" "Do you think I know no more about religion than you do, you saucy boy?" said Miss Ordway, trying to keep the whole question on the plane of a joke. Then, despite this attempt, her face grew suddenly grave. "I know what you mean," she said, "and I have no hesitation in confessing that the little homeless orphan girl puts both of us to the blush. At least I ought to be ashamed. I do not remember my mother, but father certainly tried to instill Bible principles. And theoretically I know a great deal about religion." "I don't understand it," said Frederick again. "I mean, I don't understand Mag. I've known little people before who jabbered Bible verses and said prayers, even in public, in their children's meetings, and did both very much as parrots might, meaning nothing but words. I always thought it was a pity to teach children a lot of grown-up words and ways that they could not be expected to understand. Nothing that I ever saw in the lives of those whom I watched matched their words." "I know," said Miss Ordway. "I have seen such children as you describe, but Mag is different. I don't mind owning that I am studying her with the deepest interest. I'll tell you what I think makes the difference between her and others. She means business. Show her a Bible verse, and she immediately acknowledges it as containing orders for her, and sets about obeying them. When I showed her the verses about loving enemies and praying for people who ill-treated her, I thought, in view of her state of mind toward your cousin, that she had reached something that would stop her. But behold, before the next day closed, she had altered her manner toward Margaret entirely. I was curious enough to question her, and I found that she was perfectly childlike in her explanations. There is the most delicious mixture of child and woman about her. She had no theories to advance, and in fact was so interested in Margaret, and so eager to make the time pass less drearily, that she had no special interest in theorizing about it. "I'm so sorry for her, Miss Ordway," she said, "and I can't help liking to help her now. I don't think I could have meant anything I said yesterday, only I thought I did, but anyhow I don't now." And away she flew to carry a glass of milk to Margaret. Frederick," with a sudden change of tone. "Yes'm," said Frederick, meekly. He and Miss Ordway had grown to be very firm friends. "Isn't it time that you and I began to take lessons of little Mag? I confess to you that the child has something that I would give a great deal to possess, a certain settled faith in God as her Father, a certain assurance that He will make all things work together for her good. That is certainly worth having." "How did she get it?" asked Frederick, curiously. "She is a very ignorant child, immensely ignorant about 1,000 things that girls of her age generally know, and has had no religious instruction whatever. How did a child like that jump suddenly into such mysterious knowledge and experience as this?" "Didn't I tell you? She obeyed orders. You should hear her tell the story. It is simplicity itself. It was your own book, the one you gave her last Christmas, that began her education. She found there that some one called her to come to Him, and she had been told that she must run just as soon as she was called. So she went, and He did the rest. That is all that she knows about the process. But any one can see how it is transforming her life. Frederick, I really envy her." The boy looked at her curiously for a moment, then laughed a little as he said, "I do myself at times. She seems to have such a settled conviction that somebody who can manage her, and events, and everything, has taken her in charge. I think of it often now that my mother is—" His voice faltered and stopped. For a moment he could not add a word. All Miss Ordway's heart went out in sympathy for him. She knew how the sentence might end in his thought. He struggled with his pain, and at last added, "Is not well. But that is nonsense. Of course it is on account of the warm weather. She will be all right when the cool, bracing days come." "I hope so," Miss Ordway said, trying to speak cheerfully. "But, Frederick, I am wondering whether you and I cannot profit by this poor little girl's example. We both have Bibles, and I think, from something you told me, that we give about equal attention to them. What if we should reform? Little Mag goes steadily through her Bible, and takes such direction as it comes. She gets along wonderfully well, but I think I should begin with the New Testament. Suppose we together turn over a new leaf, and see what will come of it." "How far do you mean that the leaf shall be turned?" he asked, studying her face the while, to see if she was really in earnest. "Why, entirely over. If you will join me, I will agree to read a chapter in my New Testament every day, and order my life by its directions." "There is more than that," he said quickly, and he spoke in the tone of one who felt afraid that he might be referring to something that his listener would not in the least understand. "More than what?" asked Miss Ordway briskly. "You speak in riddles." "I don't think I can explain very well. I am not used to talking on such subjects." His face flushed, and he turned half way from Miss Ordway, but she waited for more. "What I mean is," he said, beginning with difficulty, "that the reading of the Bible is but a small part of it." "Of course it is, but I added, living up to its directions." "Yes, but there is more than that. Or rather, it isn't possible to do that without something else. Miss Ordway, you said that you had more training in these matters than I. Don't you know what I mean? I think they call it conversion." "Oh," said Miss Ordway, "yes, I know what you mean. But, Frederick, that isn't our part." He looked at her blankly. "Don't you understand? Our part is to follow the directions, and God does the rest." "One can't follow the directions, Miss Ordway. I know more about the Bible than you think I do. Very early in your reading of the New Testament you will come to commands or inferences that it isn't possible for me, at least, to carry out. Take the very direction that you pointed out to poor little Mag about forgiving your enemies, and blessing them that curse you, and doing good to them that you hate, and all the rest of it. Don't you think you see me living up to such a state of things?" "Yes," said Miss Ordway, firmly. "If little Mag can do it, you and I ought to be able to. The truth is, Frederick, we do not know what we could do if we had the help that Mag secured. Don't you believe, when she prayed that night, that she received the strength she asked for? I do. The question is, have you and I strength of character enough to take a decided stand, choose the Bible for our guide book, and Jesus Christ will be our guide, and let him do with us as he will? I've been thinking about this for a long time, ever since little Mag set me at it, indeed, and as you are the one who set her to thinking, it seems as though you ought to join me." Some time before this they had moved away from the hall and were standing near a little side table in the parlor. Miss Ordway was resting her hand for support on a great book which lay there; and as she closed her earnest words, looking up at the young fellow's face, he laughed a slight, embarrassed laugh. "I don't know where to begin," he said at last. "Begin at the beginning. I have. Look here." She opened the Bible, and turning the leaves quickly, reached the verse, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." "There," she said, "that is the beginning, so far as I understand it. I have resolved to follow him. The mysterious part, the change that must come over my feelings and plans and hopes before I can do what he wants, I look to him to give. Frederick, will you join me?" Upstairs, Margaret Lancaster was studying a question that interested her. She had been crosser than usual that morning. Various things had happened to cause this. In the first place, Miss Ordway's friends, the Duanes, had gone back to town, and she had not so much as been able to see them for a few minutes. It is true that this was because she declined to receive a call from them in her bedroom. She wanted to be carried downstairs to the sitting room, and as the doctor would not allow this, the whole plan had to be given up. "As if I wanted girls like the Duanes, who live in style all the while, to come up to this stuffy little bedroom and call on me in bed!" she said angrily, and held stoutly to her determination to do no such thing. Then her foot and back took revenge on her for being so restless, and ached nearly all night. So the morning found her hard to get on with. Even her gentle aunt nearly lost patience with the poor girl's whims. When Frederick, who was making his morning call, ventured to suggest that the kinks that used to be in Margaret's hair must have somehow got into her temper, that young lady broke all bounds. "I wish you would every one of you go away," she said, turning on her pillow and speaking in the most querulous of tones. "You are all tired of me, I can see that plainly. And Fred is just as disagreeable as he can be. I don't know what he comes up here for. I'm sure I have enough to try me without him. I wish everybody would let me alone. Send Mag here, she is the only one in the house who knows how to make it pleasant for me, or cares to try." Fortunately her aunt had left the room before this tirade began. So the nurse girl and Frederick were the ones who had the benefit of it. The young fellow had borne a good deal from his cousin that morning, and just what he might have been tempted to say in reply, had not Mag at that moment appeared, no one will know. He lingered to see the cheerful patience with which she greeted the nervous invalid's ill humor, and then went down to his talk with Miss Ordway. Perhaps it was no wonder that he felt, just then, the impossibility of following out the teachings of the New Testament, even with regard to friends, to say nothing of enemies. The contrast between the Mag of the present and the Mag who had attended her during the first few days of her illness presently struck Margaret Lancaster, and she began a search after the reason. "What was the matter with you when I was first hurt? You were just as glum as you could be, and didn't try to do anything to make the time pass." Poor truthful Mag! What was she to answer to such a question? Yet there was something very sweet to her in the suggestion that it gave. "Am I different now?" she could not help asking timidly. She had tried so hard to be helpful. "Why, of course you are. You know that without asking. You tell some quite interesting stories. That is, they interest me now when I can't read, nor go anywhere, nor see anybody worth seeing, and you do as well as you can, I guess." This was in a tone of great condescension. "But at first you didn't. I thought you were stupider than ever, and really hateful some of the time. What was the matter?" Mag looked down, her cheeks aflame. How could she tell just the truth? Yet of course she must tell nothing else. "I didn't love you," she said at last, in the lowest and most timid of tones. Margaret was very much astonished. "Didn't love me!" she repeated. "Mercy! What had that to do with it? Who asked you to love me?" "I didn't think you had been good to me," murmured Mag, "and I couldn't feel right, and love you, and want to help you, and comfort you." "The idea! How did you want me to treat you, pray? Well, what made you different all of a sudden? Do you love me now?" "Yes." Mag looked up with sweet eyes, and met the fixed gaze unflinchingly. "I do love you now, and want to help make the time pass faster, and do everything for you that I possibly can." "Why do you? What made the change?" Mag's eyes dropped again, but her voice came low and clear. "I prayed about it. I asked God to show me how to love you, and want to do for you, and want you to be happy, and he did." "You prayed about me! Well, if ever I heard of anything so queer in my life! As if praying to love people would do any good, anyway! I don't believe you have what they call common sense, Mag Jessup. I don't, really. You are so awfully queer. But I don't care, since you amuse me. Finish that silly story now. What became of the prince?" Chapter 19 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. A New Home. It was a January day, clear, cold, and beautiful. Mag Jessup was standing on the steps of a handsome house in Clinton Avenue, waiting for her car. She had changed a good deal since the days when she had waited on Margaret Lancaster, and shelled peas, and picked over berries and pared vegetables on the back porch of Mrs. Perkins's summer boarding house. For one thing, she had grown taller, and her form had rounded out, and her complexion cleared. She was still brown of skin, but on her cheeks was the glow of health, and the eyes, that had been considered too large for her face, now matched it better. Perhaps her dress had much to do with the change. It was by no means rich or expensive, but it fitted her perfectly, and was very neatly made in the prevailing style, and the colors harmonized with her eyes and skin. Her hair, too, had changed. It was still a sunny brown, but it had grown thick and long, and was very carefully brushed, and tied back with ribbons. Greater changes than these had come to Mag Jessup, and, for that matter, to others who made her world. In the first place, Miss Ordway was Miss Ordway no longer, but Mrs. Ward Duane, by which means Elise and Elsie Duane, those winsome young girls who had come with their sister to Mrs. Perkins's summer boarding house, had become her sisters. Mrs. Duane lived in Clinton Avenue now, the same city that held Mrs. Perkins and her winter boarding house, but miles away from the latter. And Mag Jessup had lived on Clinton Avenue ever since the new home was established there. It had been, all that summer, part of Miss Ordway's little plan to bring this to pass, but as she was not ready to explain the steps by which she meant to do it, she had naturally not spoken of it even to Fred Ainsworth, despite his many plans for, and anxieties about, Mag Jessup's future. Several weeks before the wedding took place, however, Mag Jessup knew that she was to be table waitress and general errand girl for Mrs. Ward Duane, and was happy. There had been more trouble in bringing this state of things to pass than Mag knew about. Mrs. Perkins had decidedly opposed it, and it was feared for a time that the whole scheme would have to be abandoned. She declared that she was the one who had had all the care of Mag, and the trouble of bringing her up, in the days when she was good for nothing but to be in the way, and now when, after careful training, she was really beginning to make herself useful, It was unreasonable to suppose that she, Mrs. Perkins, would be willing to let her go, and ungrateful in the child to be willing to go. But gratitude was not what she expected in this world. It was Kate Perkins who finally helped to turn the scale. Kate knew that Miss Ordway, when she became Mrs. Duane, intended to send the little girl to school, and she assured her mother that it would be "too mean for anything" to keep Mag away from people who were rich enough to dress her up, and give her the chances that she ought to have. Perhaps there was no one in the world whose good opinion Mrs. Perkins valued more than she did that of her plain-spoken daughter, Kate, who seemed to have what her mother called "odd ideas." A few talks with this young daughter determined her to change her mind, and without much further trouble Mag Jessup was transferred to her new home as soon as the Duanes returned from their wedding trip. In almost every way the home had been a surprise to her. She began by being much astonished at Mrs. Duane's directions to her to wear her "best clothes" every day, and in discovering very soon afterwards that the much worn blue dresses that she had brought in a neat package from Mrs. Perkins's were given to the little colored girl who came for cold pieces. "They were not suited to your present work," Mrs. Duane explained. "I want you to be always ready to receive my callers and show them into the parlor, and in order to do this properly you must be neatly dressed. Besides, Mr. Duane and I like to be waited upon at the table by a little girl who looks as well as she can." Mag said not a word, but obeyed orders, not without some inner misgivings in regard to Sunday. Mrs. Duane assured her that she should go regularly, not only to Sunday school, but to church, and if she wore her best dress every day, and her lovely brown hat and sack whenever she went out on errands, how long would they look well enough to wear to church? Before the second week in her new home had closed, her heart was set at rest. A new Sunday dress and hat and coat were waiting for her when she went upstairs from the dining room on Saturday evening. Quite new, every bit of them; not made from anything that had been worn before. It was Mag's first perfectly new dress. Her way of receiving the gifts was like Mag Jessup. She came down to Mrs. Duane's room after breakfast on Sunday morning, dressed as she had been directed, in the new garments, and with her Bible in her hand open to the place that had become very familiar to her since the days in which she had "found Margaret Lancaster" in it. Her eyes were shining, and her voice was very sweet as she said: "If you please, Mrs. Duane, I have found verses just for me, and I'm not going to take thought about it any more." "That sounds serious," said Mrs. Duane, smiling. "As a rule, people do too little thinking, instead of too much. What have you found?" So Mag read: "Take no thought, saying, What shall we eat? Or, What shall we drink? Or, Wherewithal shall we be clothed? For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things." "I was worried," confessed Mag, "for fear I should get my best dress looking so bad, from wearing it every day, that you would not think it would do to wear to church and Sunday school, and I thought about it a good deal, and there wasn't any use, because he knew all the time that I was going to have a beautiful new one on purpose for church." Mrs. Duane laughed. "So that is what has been filling your thoughts, is it?" she said, pleasantly. "And you have decided to do no more thinking along that line? A very good resolution. I advise you to keep it as long as you can. An excellent rule in life I have found to be, thus far, to think about what I wear only as much as is necessary in order to be properly clothed. While you stay with me, Mag, I will see to it that you have clothes for every day, and for Sunday too." In that way the dress question was settled. But there were other very astonishing things, among them Mag's own room. It was not large, but it seemed so to her. There were 2 windows, and they were dressed in white; so were the bed and the bureau, and everything, for that matter, that could be. "You are so fond of white," said Mrs. Duane, well pleased that she had made Mag's great eyes sparkle, "that I thought I would dress your room in it. The covers are very simply made, and are easily washed. I will teach you how to take care of them yourself, and to make new ones to use in exchange for these." There was white matting on the floor, and a crimson and white rug at the bedside. Meg thought it the most beautiful room in the world. Occasionally there came to her a wistful feeling that Margaret Lancaster should see it. Margaret's mother and father had come home, and they were all spending the winter in this same great city, but they lived in a different world from Mrs. Duane, and Meg thought she was not likely ever to see Margaret Lancaster again. Never mind, what did it matter, since she had a lovely new home, and everybody was just as kind and nice to her as they could be. But the most astonishing change to Mag was that she went to school. Nothing whatever had been said to her about that, and it came to her that October morning with all the charm of a great surprise. It is true that Margaret Lancaster would not have called it going to school, but I am in doubt whether a better school, all things considered, could have been found for Mag than was established in the library at No. 636 Clinton Avenue. Mr. Duane, who was himself a student and a specialist in English history, had been very much amused at his wife's account of little Mag's way of studying her one book. He questioned and cross-questioned the little girl at different times, until he learned exactly how much she knew about history, and was astonished with the result. "I never before realized," he said to his wife, "that so much could be learned from one book, and a child's book at that. But the little girl certainly has a talent for history. It must be cultivated." So he set about cultivating it. Every day he gave an hour out of his busy life to the hitherto neglected little girl, with a view of teaching her the best way of learning the great story of the past. Mrs. Duane, for her part, undertook to teach the other common branches of study. They had talked it over together, and decided that Mag's knowledge and ignorance were both so surprising that for a time it would be useless to send her to school. She would not grade anywhere. She was an excellent reader, having taught herself to read as though every word interested her deeply, as indeed it did. But she knew almost nothing about numbers, and was alarmingly ignorant of geography, save that portion of it which had to do with her beloved book. By reason of her habit of copying scraps of writing wherever she found them, she had learned to write a remarkably good hand. And because she had lived upon her 3 books, the Bible, Little Pillows, and the Child's History of England, she had learned to express her ideas in remarkably good language. All these puzzling contradictions would simply bewilder the ordinary teacher, and it was therefore decided that for the first year Mag should be trained to study at home, with a view to her "catching up," so as to be on a level with girls of her age. So it came to pass that this small woman, who had expected to be at all times at the call of the cook or the chambermaid, and to make herself useful in 100 ways between times, found that she was held as carefully to regular hours as though Mrs. Duane had kept a private school for training little girls. She had her morning duties in the dining room and parlor, as well as in her own room, but at 10 o'clock she was expected to go to her books. A small room opening out of Mrs. Duane's own sewing room was fitted up with books, maps, blackboard, and all conveniences, and here Mag Jessup was to spend her happy hours until 1 o'clock. When Mrs. Duane sat in her sewing room, Mag was at all times at liberty to go to her with a question or a perplexity. During this time the bell might ring and ring again for all attention Mag was to pay to it. At 1 o'clock she became little table waitress again, but Mr. and Mrs. Duane, when quite alone, amused themselves and helped her by entering into conversation with her concerning the work she had been doing that morning, so that it grew to seem like a free and easy recitation instead of the luncheon hour. Following luncheon there was nearly always some errand to do or message to take that gave the little girl a brisk, purposeful walk in their end of town. On Tuesdays, Mrs. Duane's day for receiving guests, Mag, neatly dressed, was in the hall ready to welcome callers. But she had always a book on the little table at the end of the hall for her use, and between the bells was at liberty to read or study. On Thursday, which was Mr. Duane's leisure day, he always went out somewhere with his wife. But the other afternoons that lady devoted largely to her painting, and it was Mag's duty and delight to bring her books and go over with this quaint and winning teacher the work of the morning. Mr. Duane, who was usually released from business cares by 4 o'clock on 4 days of the week, gave the little girl the hour from 5 to 6 for history. Take it all in all, a wider contrast to the life she used to live at Mrs. Perkins's boarding house could hardly have been imagined than the one Mag was living in Clinton Avenue. Yet to those who knew only the outside of things, she was merely table waiter and general errand girl for the Duanes. "Mag doesn't go to school after all," said Kate Perkins in a disappointed tone to her mother the evening after she had chanced to meet Mag on the street. "I thought they as good as promised to send her, mother, if you would let them have her." "So they did," said Mrs. Perkins, taking 3 pins out of her mouth in order to answer. She was trying to refit one of Kate's worn-out dresses to the little girl who had taken Mag's place, and it was hard work, for the girl was taller and stouter than Kate, and not so easy to suit as Mag had been. Mrs. Perkins missed little Mag in many ways. "So they did," said she, "but I thought at the time that they would probably forget it as soon as they got hold of her. The truth is, Mag had been taught and trained and drilled until she was really becoming a very useful girl, and Miss Ordway was sharp enough to see it. I have never felt very much pleased with the way in which she coaxed the child away from me. It is just as I said at the time. I had all the work, and she reaps the benefit. And this creature we have now, in Mag's place, is a nuisance if ever there was one." "Well," said Kate, her tone still dissatisfied, "I'm real sorry for Mag. She ought to go to school, and I thought Miss Ordway would be sure to send her. She said a good deal about it last year." Said Mrs. Perkins, "Of course she ought, and if she had stayed with me she would have gone. I fully meant to get round to it this winter. It is one thing to find fault with other people, and quite another to do things yourself. Mrs. Duane finds, I suppose, that it is not so easy to hire a servant and then send her to school. Mag has become a very useful girl, thanks to my training." Mrs. Perkins honestly believed that she would have sent Mag to school if she had had her, and honestly believed that it was entirely her training that had made Mag a useful girl. For that matter, her training undoubtedly had a good deal to do with it, for Mrs. Perkins was a very neat woman, and knew how work should be done. The higher training that Mag had received through her 3 books, the weary housekeeper did not understand. Chapter 20 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. A Memorable Birthday. Mag would by no means have appreciated the pity that Kate Perkins bestowed on her. She was royally happy. To study and learn had been her ambition ever since Frederick Ainsworth had spoken to her about it so earnestly. Now she was doing it. A better school than she attended she believed could not have been found, and she was undoubtedly right. Both Mrs. and Mr. Duane knew how to help people to learn, and were deeply interested in their pupil. The little girl made most surprising progress, and by the time she reached her 15th birthday it had been decided that she was now fairly ready for school life. What school should be chosen had been a matter of grave importance to Mrs. Duane, who had her own theories about education. The public school of their ward was a long distance from their home, and it happened that Mrs. Duane knew, and did not in the least approve, 2 of the teachers under whose care Mag would naturally be. After much talk between Mr. and Mrs. Duane, they agreed upon a plan that would undoubtedly astonish many of their acquaintances. But fortunately they did not care for that. Just a pleasant ride from their home, and not a very long walk from it, on pleasant days, was a private school, for whose chief Mrs. Duane had the highest respect. She took not many pupils, and all were girls, and she watched over their interests in every possible way. Of course, to attend this school was a somewhat expensive matter, but Miss Ordway had had money enough for her own needs before she married a wealthy man. Why should they not send their little maidservant to a school that cost money, if they chose to do so? Before Mag knew anything about it, all arrangements had been made, and on this January morning, when she stood waiting for a car, she was about to begin her life as a pupil at the Garland Place school. "You can walk home if you feel like it," explained Mrs. Duane in reply to Mag's protest against spending money for car fare. "But it is now so late that you might possibly be tardy if you undertook to walk, and that would be a poor beginning. Remember, you are to go directly to the office, that side building that I showed you yesterday, and give your name and street and number. The secretary will attend to the rest. Your name is entered as Margaret Kane Jessup. Don't forget and say 'Mag,' or they may not recognize you." Imagine, if you can, how Margaret Kane Jessup felt as she sat in the street car, being carried to her new world. The cars had become familiar to her, as she often went of errands for Mrs. Duane to such long distances as to need to ride. More than that, she had been taken frequently on excursions that required their aid, but this was the first time they had been used to carry her on an errand of her own. She glanced at the conductor as she handed him her ticket, and wondered what he would think if he knew she was going to school. Meantime, in the secretary's office at Garland Place, girls were gathering from all parts of the city, whose names had been entered for the mid-year term. By 10 o'clock dozens of them were moving about the large, cheery schoolroom. The first day of the term was a sort of gala day in this school. No very regular work was done, seats were chosen, desks arranged, lessons assigned, and all things put in order for actual work the next morning. During this period the girls were allowed to chat together freely, and were often left with no teacher in charge. Such was the state of things when Carrie West made her announcement. "Girls, we have one new scholar this mid-year at least. I was in the office when she gave in her name. It is Margaret Kane Jessup. She is a little bit of a creature, not half so large as her name, but she looks as though she might be pleasant." Margaret Kane Jessup. It was our old friend Margaret Lancaster who repeated this name very slowly, as though she stopped over each syllable to wonder. "Are you sure, Carrie? How queer that it should be exactly the same name, but of course it isn't Mag. Where does this girl come from? Did you hear her address?" "Yes, indeed, she is from 636 Clinton Avenue. I noticed the number because it is exactly ours, only we are Pearmain Street instead of Clinton Avenue." Margaret Lancaster repeated the new scholar's street and number in precisely the dazed way that she had her name, and the girls turned and looked at her curiously, laughing the while, as Carrie said, "What is the matter with you, Margie, that you are guilty of the inelegance of repeating all my sentences, as Madame Lalande would say?" Her answer was, "Carrie West, you must be mistaken. I know the people who live at 636 Clinton Avenue. It is Mr. Ward Duane, the one who married Miss Ordway, the artist, and they have a servant, a little brown runt of a creature, named Mag Jessup, but of course she wouldn't be coming to Garland Place to school." "I can't help it," insisted Carrie. "A girl who gave her name as Margaret Kane Jessup and her number as 636 Clinton Avenue is in the office this minute, and Mrs. Garland is talking with her. If you don't believe it, you can go and look at her." This proved to be unnecessary, for at the moment the door leading from the secretary's office opened, and Mrs. Garland appeared, and behind her, of all persons in the world, Mag Jessup. Margaret Lancaster knew her in an instant, though many things had taken place since she had seen her that had greatly changed Mag Jessup. Mrs. Duane had seen to it that she was quite as neatly dressed as any of the girls. As a rule, those who attended Mrs. Garland's school had sensible mothers, so nearly all the dressing was simple and appropriate to school life. In truth, it was well known that Mrs. Garland herself disapproved of any other style. So there was nothing conspicuous about little Mag. Her eyes were fully as large as ever, but the almost wild look that they used to have when she was startled or excited had passed away. She was now a becomingly dressed, quiet, well-behaved young girl. Margaret Lancaster could only stare at her. She did not yet believe even the evidence of her own eyes. It could not be possible that Mag Jessup was entered as a pupil at Garland Place private school. By noon it was quite a settled thing, and Margaret gathered a few choice spirits about her and blazed her indignation. "The idea! Why, she is just a servant. She used to live at that Mrs. Perkins's on East Street, the one who keeps a large boarding house." "Mistaken! Why, Addie Phillips, I know her as well as I do you. When we went to the country a year ago last summer, we boarded with Mrs. Perkins at her summer boarding house, and this little brown thing was one of her servants. She picked berries, you know, and shelled peas, and pared potatoes, and did all sorts of things. Why, she was the one who waited on me a great deal after I was hurt. Of course I know her. When Miss Ordway married Mr. Duane, she took Mag with her to be table waiter. I remember we laughed about her having such a small table waiter. I must say I think it is queer to have her come here with all of us. What will we do with her?" "I don't see that we are called upon to do anything with her," laughed one of the girls. "That is, if she behaves herself. She looks like a nice, modest little creature. I don't suppose she will hurt any of us. Why didn't you go up and speak to her, Margie, if you knew her so well? She must have felt rather lonesome among all us girls." Margaret drew herself up as well as her lameness would allow, for the poor girl had never recovered from that wild drive that she took on the day of the picnic, and said haughtily, "I don't know her as a schoolgirl. I never made her acquaintance in that line, and never expect to. If she has come here to work for Mrs. Garland, I will speak to her, of course, just as I would to any servant. But at present I don't know her." Several of the girls laughed, and one more outspoken than the others said, "Margie, you are too silly for anything sometimes. What difference does it make whether the new scholar is a servant, or what she is, so long as she behaves herself?" When Margaret moved slowly and haughtily away, they talked about her a little, as schoolgirls will. "Isn't it queer that Margie Lancaster should have such grand ideas, and feel so superior to almost everybody?" "Her father isn't a very wealthy man. My father says he is quite embarrassed, and that he has lost a good deal of money lately." "My mother says that Margie Lancaster is too old for her years," contributed one. "Just think, she isn't 14 yet, and yet she talks and acts like a young lady." "She always did," laughed a girl who was older than the others. "I am nearly 3 years older than she, and I felt like a very little girl who ought to be in a kindergarten the first time I met her. She has been used to grown-up people all her life, they say, and has never learned to act like a young girl. She looks older than she is, too, and that is against her. Madame Lalande could hardly believe me one day when I happened to say that Margie wasn't 14 yet. 'Why, Mademoiselle Hervey,' she said, 'she is older than yourself, certainement.'" "Well, I wonder if that new little girl, who has disturbed Margie so, looks younger than she is," said Carrie West. "It doesn't seem as though she was old enough to join any of our classes." But Carrie West discovered her mistake in a few days. Miss Jessup, as the teachers called her, was not only in the same language class with the other girls of nearly her age, but was also in the leading history class in the school. In certain studies she was not yet their equal, but from the very first recitation in history it became apparent that they must look well to their honors if they did not mean to allow little Mag to carry them off. For the first few days Mag cannot be said to have had a very social time with her classmates. Margaret Lancaster refused to acknowledge her presence even by a bow, although at their first meeting Mag had looked pleasantly at her, expecting some sort of greeting. Her face took on a deeper red for a moment when she found that she was not to be noticed, but she turned away without a word and opened her book as soon as possible. Several of the girls who were more or less under Margaret's influence, although they felt ashamed of her, held aloof from Mag, not knowing quite what to do, and others who were busy with their books or their fun thought nothing about her, and it might have been that Mag, who was shy and quiet, would have made no friends in the schoolroom had it not been for something that happened when she had been there but a few days. One morning, reaching the schoolroom 10 minutes before the bell rang for opening exercises, she was just in time for Alice Wheeler's news. "Oh, girls, don't you think we have 2 new scholars? They have come to spend the rest of the winter in the city, and the girls are to begin here this morning." "Who? What girls? Why on earth don't you tell us what you are talking about?" These were some of the ways of receiving the news. "Why, the Duane girls, Elise and Elsie. Don't you know them? You do, Margie Lancaster. They are just lovely girls, both of them. They are here with their married sister. Their father had to go abroad again on business, and Mrs. Duane went with them; and Mrs. Schuyler, their married sister, has brought them here so as to be near her brother for the winter, and they are coming to school this morning." Now it happened that little Mag could have told that bit of news 2 days before. Mrs. Duane had told her all about it. She and her husband had spent the evening before with the Schuylers at the hotel where they were staying. For the first 5 minutes after she heard the news, Mag's face had glowed with pleasure, then the light had died out of her eyes, and she had said not a word. She had known Elsie and Elise Duane for only 2 weeks at the summer boarding house, and she had known and waited upon Margaret Lancaster all summer. If Margaret had forgotten her so entirely as never to speak to her, what could be expected of the Duane girls? Much excitement was created at Garland Place over the new arrivals. All the girls knew about the Duanes, and a few of them had the honor of a slight acquaintance. Among these was Margaret Lancaster, who had had the good fortune to meet them at Long Branch the summer before. She was voluble in their praises, and inclined to think that she must be the most intimate acquaintance they had in the school. It was not until the 10 minutes' recess at 11 o'clock that the new scholars were introduced to the school by Mrs. Garland. It was Margaret Lancaster who immediately moved forward and claimed acquaintance, kissing them both eagerly, and telling them how glad she was to have them in their school. They seemed pleased with her kind greeting, but were almost shy before so many watching eyes, until Elise, looking eagerly about her, made a sudden dash and rushed almost into little Mag's arms. "Oh, you dear!" she cried impetuously. "Ward said we would see you here this morning, and we were oh so glad! You can't think. Elsie, here is our dear Mag!" Then Elsie, too, turned abruptly away from Margaret Lancaster and the favored girl whom she had just introduced, and went over to little Mag Jessup and kissed her again and again. The scholars looked on and said nothing. But from that moment most of them thought that Margaret Lancaster was probably mistaken in the place that Mag Jessup held in the Duane family. It was silly to suppose that the young Duanes would greet a servant in their brother's house in any such fashion. Others of them decided that whether Mag Jessup was a servant or not, they liked her and meant to show it. They guessed they could afford to, if the Duane girls thought so much of her as that. So the Duanes, all unknown to themselves, settled Mag Jessup's place for her in the minds of a number of girls who had had silly ideas put into their minds by coming in contact with a few who had secured those silly ideas from people older than themselves. Mrs. Garland and her fellow teachers did what they could to keep their school strong and pure. But they could not counteract altogether the influence of a few foolish mothers who had allowed their little girls to play at being grown up long before they ought to have thought of such a thing. Perhaps it was really worse than that. The false ideas they were allowing to take root and grow would have disgraced any age that they might reach. Poor Margaret Lancaster, for instance, had been much with people who had led her to believe that wealth and the sort of position that wealth gives in the world were really the most important things of life. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mag's Wages. It took but a few weeks for Mag Jessup to become thoroughly acquainted with school routine and settle down to hard work. Life was not altogether blissful to her. If she had supposed that girls who went every day to school had nothing to mar their complete enjoyment, it was probably as well that she was undeceived. Margaret Lancaster, without being exactly ugly, or at least meaning to be, could not forgive poor Mag for being undeniably a favorite of the Duanes. Moreover, as the weeks went by and Mag grew used to reciting before others, it became very apparent indeed that she knew more about English history and talked more understandingly about it than did any girl in the class. She had not lived among the chief characters and personated them in her little attic room all winter for nothing. Now, Margaret Lancaster, before Mag's advent, had been the leader in this class, and as she liked to lead, the history hour had been to her the pleasantest one in the day. All this was past when Mag Jessup took her acknowledged place in the class. For a girl of Margaret's temperament to be outshone by little Mag Jessup was bitter indeed. The indifference with which she had meant to regard the young girl began to deepen into positive dislike, and she omitted no opportunity to say little hateful things about Mag, loud enough, many of them, for the girl to overhear. Mag had not been long at school before an incident occurred that gave Margaret a chance to indulge in no end of sarcasm at her expense. An incident which was in itself so funny that many, who would not otherwise have ridiculed Mag, found themselves laughing heartily at her mistake. In order for you to understand it, it will be necessary to remember that Mag, although she had, considering her opportunities, learned a great deal, she was still very ignorant of many matters that other girls seem to learn by a sort of instinct, and was inclined to be what people call credulous about a great many things. It was a custom in this school for the pupils to recite Bible verses at the opening exercises. Mrs. Garland sat on the little platform near the piano, and herself called the name of any young lady whom she chose to have recite. There was no rule about this, at least none that was known to the scholars. The same girl might be called upon 5 or 6 mornings in succession, for all that she knew to the contrary. The directions were that each pupil must always be ready to recite when called upon. It was astonishing to the girls to see what a wonderful memory Mrs. Garland had. If a scholar gave the same verse twice in the course of a week, she was sure to hear from the platform in smoothest tones, "Is that verse a special favorite of yours, Miss Smith?" or, "My dear Miss Jones, that is a very choice verse, but there are others equally so. You have given it to us several times, I believe." The consequence was that the girls prepared their Bible verses with care, and learned many of them in the course of the year at school. One morning, Mag, who enjoyed this part of the day very much, and who chose her verse with great care, stood near little Alice West's seat, waiting for the piano to sound the strains that meant "Be seated." While she waited, she took up a neat little black book that lay on Alice's table. Small books will probably always have a special attraction for Mag, because they remind her of her dear little pillows. Behold, the tiny, handsomely bound gilt-edged book was a part of the Bible, the book of Proverbs bound by itself. How delightful! Mag had often wished that she had a Bible so tiny that it could be carried about in her pocket. She opened this one eagerly. More than once she had stopped thoughtfully over the book of Proverbs in her Bible, and studied some of the strange, quaint verses. She had already learned from the wise man some keen truths. But this morning her eyes were held to the words that first met them. "It never rains but it pours." What could the words mean? Certainly not exactly what they said, for that very morning a slow, gentle rain was falling. Such a rain as reminded the grass and trees that spring was on its way, but there was nothing about it that suggested the word "pour," and in Mag's experience nothing was more common than those soft, silent, rainy days. Of course she had by this time learned that there was such a thing as figurative meanings, and being an imaginative girl had had no difficulty in grasping that idea, but what this particular verse was intended to teach she could not imagine. While she stood considering, the warning strains from the piano were heard, and all the girls were marching to their seats, keeping step with the music. Before Mag had had time to collect her thoughts, she heard her name called by Mrs. Garland, and knew that her verse was waited for. The beautiful one that she had prepared for that morning's possible use had for the moment slipped from her. Never mind, she could use this new strange one, although she liked to know what words meant before she spoke them. In the utter silence that awaited her, the young girl's voice clearly sounded through the room. "It never rains but it pours." To her dismay, the recitation was followed by a very distinct ripple of laughter, and even Mrs. Garland let an amused smile flit over her face as she said, "You have made a remarkable selection this morning, Miss Jessup." Then she touched the little silver bell at her side, and order was instantly restored. Throughout the service that followed, poor Margaret sat with downcast eyes, blushing and wondering. What was there so strange in her recitation? To be sure it did not especially fit the occasion, at least she supposed it did not, though when she could not yet imagine what it meant, how was she to be certain? Still, other girls recited verses that were not even so appropriate as this, for it certainly rained this morning. And they had not laughed, even when little Louise Ellis repeated, "Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan." She could not understand it, and it troubled her so that she lost most of the verses, and could not join in the singing. But Mrs. Garland's prayer quieted and helped her. It was nearly an hour afterwards that the lady called her to the desk, and after giving her some general directions about the morning's work, laid her hand kindly on her arm as she said, "My dear, there are girls in my schoolroom whom I should have suspected of a bad joke if one of them had recited at prayers the words you gave us, but I believe I know you better. Will you explain to me what it all means?" Margaret looked steadily at the open grammar in her hand, and struggled with her voice to keep it from quivering, as she said, "I hardly know how to explain, ma'am. I saw the verse a moment before in Alice West's Bible, and I thought it a very strange one, and could not imagine what it meant. Then when you called my name first, the verse I had learned did not come to me, but this one did, and so I said it." Mrs. Garland's face wore a look of bewilderment. "You found the words in Alice West's Bible!" she repeated. "Yes, Mrs. Garland, just this morning. I never saw them before, and I wanted to remember them to ask Mrs. Duane what they meant." "My dear, will you go to Alice's table and get her Bible for me to look at?" Mag turned at once to do so. Little Alice was at that hour in her recitation room with the younger pupils, but the small black book that had attracted Mag lay on her table. She returned with it to Mrs. Garland's desk. "It is only a piece of the Bible, ma'am," she said, as she passed it to her, "but there is the verse on the first page." Light broke over the puzzled teacher's face. "My dear," she said, "I understand. You thought this was quotations from the book of Proverbs in the Bible? I suppose you have not met before the word proverb used in any other way. It was a most natural mistake. But not a word of this little volume is taken from the Bible. Instead, it is the supposed wise sayings of many different men, gathered from all classes of books." "But what can it mean?" asked Mag, her face ablaze with mortification over her mistake, yet unable to let this opportunity for acquiring information slip away. "It often rains without pouring. It does this morning." "Yes," said Mrs. Garland, smiling a kind indulgent smile on her ignorant young pupil. "It simply means to express the idea that when a bit of marked good or ill fortune come to one, others of like nature are apt to follow. At least such has so often been the case that it seemed natural to somebody to put the thought into this phrase." Poor Mag! Before the day was done, and indeed for many following days, she had occasion to realize the truth of the proverb thus explained. The discomfort that she felt because of her blunder was deepened and increased tenfold by the manner in which the girls received it. Had she dealt with only the refined and sweet-hearted Mrs. Garland, the whole subject would soon have been forgotten, but Margaret Lancaster, and those who copied her, took care that Mag should not forget. The moment she appeared in the halls, at recess, or crossed the grounds in the morning, or passed out of the great gateway at night, somebody was sure to shout after her, "Take care, Mag Jessup, you'll get wet," or "Oh, don't you want to borrow an umbrella? It is going to pour, I think," or some other arrangement of her unfortunate proverb. Nothing was said about all this at home, Mag having decided very early in her school experience that people who had been so very, very kind as Mrs. and Mr. Duane deserved to hear only the best and brightest news from there, but her own pretty little room could have told the story of some very bitter tears, had it been trained to speak. I have given you only an illustration of her trials, none of them large nor serious in any way, none of them worth complaining about to teachers or special friends, at least so Mag thought. But nevertheless most of them were hard to bear, and shadowed what else would have been a perfectly bright winter to the orphan girl. Yet among those schoolgirls I suppose there was scarcely one but would have opened her eyes wide in amazement, and indignantly denied the charge of cruelty to their schoolmate. Most of them were simply thoughtless and fun-loving. It is worth thinking about, what heartaches one can make in the world by simply being thoughtless and selfish. Meantime, I am sure there are those who are anxious to know just how Mag Jessup treated her schoolmates in return, and when I tell them that she was steadily patient and meek toward them, I am sure there are some who will say, "Oh, nonsense! I don't believe anything of the kind. A girl who had any spirit and was treated as she was, would have given her schoolmates a piece of her mind. At least she couldn't help almost hating them." I want to assure you that Mag Jessup was a girl of spirit, and that she treated every one of her schoolmates as kindly as she knew how, and, so far from hating them, tried in every way to be kind and helpful. You are mistaken in supposing such a course impossible. That very few people meet ill treatment in this way only goes to prove that very few people try Jesus Christ's way. Mag Jessup, remember, had fought her battle and conquered once for all. Rather, she had discovered just what the Lord Jesus, whose servant she was, expected of her, and also that he had said to her, "My grace is sufficient," and "I will with the temptation provide a way of escape, so that you may be able to bear it." And she had taken him at his word. With every annoyance, though it was no more than a pin-prick, she went straight to Jesus Christ, and he was true to his word, as he always is, and she was able to bear it. You think her a very unusual girl? I grant that. I am sorry to have to admit it, but it is a sad fact that only an occasional girl, even among those who say that Jesus Christ has given them new hearts and that they mean to serve him, seem to believe exactly what he says, and trust him to help them keep their word. If I can help those who read this story to realize that Mag Jessup was unlike other girls simply because she believed and tried, and not because of anything wonderful in the girl herself, I shall have accomplished a great deal. If I can, in addition to that, induce others to ask themselves, "Why should not we be unusual girls and boys?" and to resolve then and there to try every day to live up to the rules that Jesus has given, I shall have accomplished that for which, above all other objects, I write. I am sure that the grave trouble with the lives of many young Christians grows out of the fact that they do not consider selfishness and occasional ill temper, and a nursing of the spirit that cries for petty revenge for ill treatment, very bad faults. Instead, they think of them as states of mind that, as one girl expressed it, "can't be helped anyhow, whether they are very bad or not, because they are so perfectly natural that you've got to feel them." What we want is not natural fruit, but that which grows after Jesus has become the Lord of the heart garden. So I want you to understand that, despite the petty troubles of her school life and the tears she was occasionally obliged to shed, Mag was, for the most part, a happy girl. She sang over her work at home in a way that pleased Mrs. Duane, and she managed her school work in a way to astonish and delight her teachers. For that she made really remarkable progress in her studies, even the schoolgirls who liked her least admitted. During these days in speaking of Mrs. Duane's house, Mag always called it home. She did not study her own heart to find out the reason. She had never spoken so of Mrs. Perkins's house. She had by no means been adopted by the Duanes. She waited at table each day with painstaking care, and was most conscientious in performing the other duties that fell to her share. She remembered that she was an orphan, and expected and wanted to earn her living. Yet without planning to do so, her heart and lips said lovingly, "Home," whenever there was occasion. Meantime, there was no question of wages between them, although Mag was led to think about it once. "Mag Jessup," called out Margaret Lancaster one morning, when Mag stood with a group of girls telling them exactly how she had fixed certain troublesome dates in her memory, "Mag Jessup, what do the Duanes pay you for your work? I suppose they give you good wages, don't they? They are awfully rich." She had meant to hurt the girl's feelings, or at least to remind her that she was by no means the equal of the young people to whom she was so eagerly talking, but Mag was too simple-hearted to catch her meaning. "Wages?" she said, breaking off abruptly in her explanation, as if to consider an entirely new idea; then her face lightening in a way that it had when a new and pleasant thought struck her. "Why, they do. They pay me very large wages indeed." The girls shouted. "Aren't you glad you know, Margie?" one of them cried, in the midst of their laughter; and Mag moved away, her eyes still bright. It had really come to her like a new thought what wonderful wages she was receiving. For the first time since she could remember, she had a home. Chapter 22 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. That little Mag Jessup. It was one morning in May that Mag, arriving early, found the schoolroom in a hum of excitement. Very splendid times were in store for some of them, and they were making the hearts of others throb with envy while they told. Mag, lingering on the outskirts, as she was inclined to do unless distinctly invited into the circle, heard scraps of news. It all had to do with one whom she remembered every day in her prayers with a gratitude that many of the talkers would not have understood. Before Miss Ordway was married, Mr. Frederick, as Mag continued to call him in her thoughts, had been suddenly summoned to join his father and mother abroad. His friends bade him good bye with faces almost as sad as his own, for he was going upon a sad errand. His mother was worse, and the gravest fears were felt lest he should not return in time to say good bye. Mag had heard of him several times since then; first, that his mother was still living when he reached Italy, then that she really seemed to be gaining a very little, then that there had been a decided change for the better, finally that there actually seemed to be hope of her entire recovery, but that she could by no means return home as yet. Therefore Mr. Ainsworth was to come to look after his long deserted business, and Mr. Frederick was to stay abroad with his mother. After that, by degrees, he dropped out of Mag's world. Mrs. Duane occasionally heard of him through his relatives, but never thought to mention the news to Mag. Still, as has been said, she had never forgotten him, and she could not help the sparkle in her eyes over the news she heard that May morning. Mr. Frederick had come home, was actually at that moment in the same city with herself. The possibility was now always before her of meeting him somewhere, and being able to tell him that she was working hard for that education which he had put it in her heart to get. "Of course I've seen him," Carrie Jones was saying. "Don't I tell you I was chatting with Margaret Lancaster when he came over to see her? He is Margaret's cousin, you know. Oh, but that girl is as proud of him as a peacock. It is too funny to see the airs she puts on." "He used to be a real handsome boy," volunteered Alice Porter. "He is yet, only I don't think you would call him a boy. He always had a way of looking older than he was, just as Margie Lancaster has, and he does now. He is, let me think, why, he must be about 19, and I should take him for 23 or 4. Oh, very handsome and so stylish, my! There isn't a college boy in this city who can compare with him." "Yes, indeed, they have come home to stay. They have gone right to their house on Laurel Avenue. It has been refurnished, they say, and everything about it is elegant. That is, Margie Lancaster says so, but then everything is always elegant that belongs to her relatives, you know." Then there was a general laugh at the absent one's expense, followed by Carrie Jones again. "Well, of course it is elegant. Mrs. Ainsworth always had exquisite taste. It is nice for Margie Lancaster, isn't it, to have a handsome grown-up cousin always at hand to go with her to places? I am afraid this world will not contain her very long, she will be so fearfully set up." "Do the Lancasters live here, or are they only staying?" This question from a comparatively new girl. "Well, I think they may be said to be living here now. They have spent 2 winters here, and that is longer than they stay anywhere. Margie's father is Admiral Lancaster, of the United States Navy, as you must have heard if you have talked with Margie for 5 minutes. That is one of the things of which she is proud. Mrs. Lancaster was abroad for more than a year to be near her husband, and Margie stayed with her Aunt Helen. She was in the country with her that time when she was hurt, you remember, girls. Then they came on here, and Margie entered this school, and wants to stay here. Therefore they will be likely to do so. She rules her mother, and her father too, I guess. I know her better than most of the girls do, for we used to live in Chicago, where they spent a good deal of their time. They boarded right next door to our house. I knew Fred Ainsworth when he was a little bit of a fellow, for he was on there one winter with his mother, and we quarreled like cats, I remember, over a balloon that we both claimed. But he has forgotten all about me, didn't succeed in remembering me very well, even after I had referred to old times and the balloon, although he pretended to for the sake of politeness. He is awfully polite." Nobody invited Mag into the circle. Nobody had an idea that she knew even Mr. Frederick Ainsworth's name, and she was obliged at last to move away, still hungry for news of him. She had so much, so very much for which to thank him. Could she hope for a chance, some time, to do it? Of course he would not remember her. He had not remembered even Carrie Jones, a beautiful young lady, with whom he played when a child. But that need make no difference. She could thank him all the same. He might come sometime to see Mrs. Duane, and she might possibly be at home, and if Mrs. Duane knew that she wanted to thank him, she would be sure to give her a chance. The chance came much earlier than she expected. That afternoon, as she stepped into the front hall on her return from school, she heard a voice that she felt sure she would have known anywhere. Mr. Frederick himself, looking so grown up and dignified as she peeped at him through the half open door, that she almost decided she should be afraid ever to speak to him. Yet he was chatting eagerly with Mrs. Duane, asking questions with a rapidity that showed him in haste to learn all about his old friends. Mag stood in the hall, hesitating. She had a message of importance for Mrs. Duane, but she dreaded to deliver it. Perhaps Mrs. Duane would remember that she used to know Mr. Ainsworth, and would try to recall her to his memory, and her heart was so full just then of all his kindness to her when she was a lonely little girl, that she was almost afraid the tears would come if Mr. Frederick should treat her as Margaret Lancaster did, for instance. That would be even worse than entire forgetfulness. She would like to wait and get used to the thought of his being at home, and train herself to remembering that, of course, he would have nothing to say to her. Duty triumphed. Mrs. Duane ought to have the word that her husband had sent, and have it immediately, therefore Mag pushed the door wider open and entered. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Duane, but may I speak to you a moment?" These words were on her lips when she heard Mr. Ainsworth's voice. "Why, can it be possible that this is— it certainly is— our little Mag? The eyes are the same, but for the rest— Are you sure that you are little Mag Jessup, the child of one book? No, 2. Bless me, I believe there were 3." The same genial voice, and he was actually holding out his hand, both hands, for her greeting. Mag, blushing and astonished, and wondering between times if he knew that his cousin, Margaret Lancaster, did not approve of her being treated as an equal, and very glad, gave him her hand, and assured him, with a laugh full of childish gleefulness, that she was the same little Mag. "Not a bit of it," he said. "You are wonderfully changed. You remember, Mrs. Duane, that I told you there were possibilities? Have a seat and tell me all about it, school life and home life, and the history of England, and all the rest." How kind he was, and how wise and how patient with her ignorance, and how interested in everything that had to do with her studies! Mrs. Duane, having received her husband's message, and finding herself obliged to go out at once to carry out his directions, invited Mr. Ainsworth to stay to dinner, and directed Mag to entertain him until her return. The hour that followed was one that Mag will always remember. It set her right about several matters concerning which she had been in danger of drawing wrong conclusions. Mr. Frederick Ainsworth's estimate of worth was evidently not like his cousin's; and he was young and rich, and had seen more of the world than had Margaret Lancaster. Mr. and Mrs. Duane and their relatives were not then different from all the rest of the world, as she was beginning to think. Here was another, from entirely another family, who was different also. Perhaps there were more. She would think better of the world than she had been doing. It was evidently larger than she had supposed. Mr. Frederick, meantime, who meant to be a lawyer, and who studied human nature wherever he had a chance, questioned and cross-questioned, and learned more about Mag's school life than she had any idea she was telling; knew more about it in an hour's time than the Duanes imagined, and made his plans accordingly. "You don't know my mother, do you?" This remark he made to Mag just as they were leaving the dining-room. Mag had served him carefully at the table, like the deft-handed little table-waiter that she had become, and had been entirely silent, of course, save when spoken to. Mr. Frederick had respected the proprieties of the table, and said not a word to her until dinner was over. "She is acquainted with you," he continued. "At least she has heard about the history of England and the little pillows, and wants to make the acquaintance of their owner. I promised to bring you to see her as soon as possible. Could you go to-morrow afternoon, do you think? I might call at the school for you if you could." "Oh, no, thank you," said Mag quickly. "I should not have time to-morrow. Friday is a very busy day." But Mrs. Duane interposed, smiling. "You mean your home duties, Mag? Then I think we can arrange it. In fact, I have already promised Mr. Ainsworth to do so." So Mag, in great wonderment and certainly no small delight over this unexpected glimpse of the beautiful world, went away with a look in her eyes that paid Mrs. Duane for whatever sacrifice she had made. In the parlor they talked about her a little. "Her eyes are as expressive as ever," said Mr. Frederick. "Do you know, Mrs. Duane, that you have a remarkable little table waitress? I have been examining her in English history, and I assure you her knowledge of it would put some of our college men quite to the blush." "She is an apt pupil," said Mr. Duane. "I have been astonished to see how wonderfully well she grasps historic situations, makes a sort of picture of them in her mind, and studies it until it becomes hers." "She acts it all out," said Mrs. Duane. "Don't you remember, Frederick, how she used to entertain herself up in that dreary attic room at Mrs. Perkins's? I think she continues much the same habit, and it accounts for the extreme clearness of her knowledge. Oh, we consider her a remarkable girl, and we are doing our best not to spoil her. See that you are as prudent." "I don't intend to spoil her," laughed Mr. Frederick. "But I know 2 or 3 of her schoolmates who need to be taught a certain lesson, and I am going to take that part of their education in mind. That is why I want to meet little Mag at the school instead of calling here for her." Mrs. Duane interested herself in Mag's next day's toilet, with the result that she appeared in school with what she was in the habit of calling her Sunday dress. "How fine we are!" murmured Margaret Lancaster, with a toss of her head toward Mag. "I wonder what is going to happen to us to-day?" As a matter of fact, Mag was not at all fine in the sense that Margaret Lancaster meant. Mrs. Duane's taste was good, and she could be trusted not to overdress a young girl for any occasion. It was the hour for history that Mr. Frederick chose for his call. "Miss Lancaster," the teacher had just said, when a side door opened and Mrs. Garland entered with her guest. Margaret, surprised and a bit flustered by the unexpected appearance of her cousin, was at a disadvantage, and did not recite nearly so well as usual. Meg gave her a surprised and pitiful glance as she made a serious mistake in names and dates, and the next moment heard her own name called. The lesson was one that had interested her even more than usual, and that morning, in reply to a question of hers, Mr. Duane had given her such a description of the situation that she had told him gleefully it was "almost like being there," so she was not only ready, but glad to recite. "She is an unusual girl in many respects," Mrs. Garland said to her guest, as he commented on the recitation. "I do not know when I have had a pupil who has interested me so deeply. Perhaps I notice her more because she is an orphan and quite alone in the world. But she has fallen among rare people. Do you know the Duanes, Mr. Ainsworth?" They gathered about him for the 5 minutes' recess that followed the history hour, those favored ones who could claim intimacy with Margaret Lancaster, and she was gracious and introduced her handsome cousin, explaining to him between times the mischief he had wrought. "You were horrid not to tell me you were coming. It was all your fault that I made such dreadful blunders in class. I never recite in that fashion, do I, girls? But I was so astonished at seeing you walk in that I couldn't gather my wits. Are you going to stay for our Shakespeare class? Oh, do, we have great fun then." "Not to-day," said Mr. Frederick. "I came by appointment. I have a young lady friend here who is engaged to dine with my mother this evening, and she was to be ready for me after history. What has become of her, I wonder? I saw and heard her in the class." "Who on earth could it be?" This question was in the eyes of every astonished girl of the group. In their opinion, every girl in that school who could have the slightest hope of dining with Mrs. Ainsworth was already one of the group about him. His cousin Margaret was as astonished as the rest, and opened her mouth to question, when the young man stopped it by saying, "Oh, here she is. Are you ready, Mag? If we make haste we shall be in time for a fair view of that picture I tried to describe to you." And those girls stood in dumb amazement, and watched the elegant Mr. Ainsworth walk away with "that little Mag Jessup," she laughing as gleefully, in response to something he said, as though he were a schoolmate of hers. "Well! What do you make of that? I never heard of such a thing in my life!" These were some of the ejaculations that could have been heard as soon as the dumbness gave place to speech. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Excellent. The mid-year examinations of Mrs. Garland's school were drawing near. Almost a year now since Mag Jessup had entered the school as a pupil. In that time she had proved to schoolmates, as well as teachers, the position she meant to hold. Nobody thought of her as other than an excellent scholar. She was still behind some of her age in certain studies, but was always so thoroughly well prepared, and so sure of all ground that she had been over, that she was steadily "catching up," even in these; and in history and composition it was generally conceded that she and Margaret Lancaster were by far the best scholars in the school. As to which of the two was ahead, opinions differed. Margaret Lancaster had her friends who stoutly argued that of course she was a better scholar than "that little Mag Jessup." But, on the other hand, Mag had many friends, some of whom smiled triumphantly and said, "Wait until you see which wins the prize." The prize which was attracting most attention was the one for English history and composition combined. It was unlike any other award in Mrs. Garland's school. That lady did not as a rule approve of prizes, in the strict meaning of that word. Youthful human nature is too ugly to run a race in which only one can win. This was her explanation to some of her friends who urged more prizes. But there were other friends who said Mrs. Garland was wise, and that the ugliness of human nature in this respect was not confined to young people. But the history prize had the right of way. It had been an institution for many years, being first established by Mrs. Garland's grandfather, who was a student of history. He had arranged that every year there should be a trial of skill in the history class. every pupil who chose to compete for the prize being required to write a paper of not less than 2,500 words, and not more than 5,000, which paper was to be a sort of historic novel, that is, it was to be written in narrative form, and the characters were to be fictitious, but every statement in it must be true to history, and in keeping with the period of time which the writer chose to represent. 1 week before the close of the mid-year term, these papers were to be read before the assembled school, and a committee chosen by the faculty was to select the 2 that they agreed were the best, to be read at the public exercises with which the mid-year closed, at which time a committee of award, originally chosen by the giver of the prize, and self-perpetuating, one dropping out and a new one being added each year, was to determine which young lady should receive the prize, and to award the same. The prize itself was valuable, and was hedged about by useful regulations. It was $50 in gold, all to be spent for books, and only $5 worth to be bought at a time, with 3 months to intervene between each purchase. Evidently the old grandfather had had to do with young people who wasted much money in the hasty and careless buying of books. Margaret Lancaster sneered at the prize and its regulations. "I don't care a straw for his old $50, she said loftily. "Of course I can buy as many books as I want, without his money, and I don't have to wait any 3 months to get them, either. He was an absurd old man who must have had idiots to deal with, but what I am after is the honor. I can win the prize easily enough. Mamma says expressing myself on paper is my forte." This she said in the early days of the year, before Mag Jessup had been recognized as such a formidable rival. After a time she began to look glum when Mag recited, and to be in ill humor for several hours after Mag's history paper had been returned to her with the peculiar mark on it made by Mrs. Garland's blue pencil, and which every girl in the school knew meant "excellent." Twice the mark on Margaret's paper meant only "very good," and Mag's was "excellent." To a girl of Margaret Lancaster's disposition, this was food for many hours of glumness. Before the former year had closed, Margaret had resolved to go on with her studies in history during the summer, and to practice writing a paper each week, and to get her cousin Fred to help her. Then they would see in the fall if that little servant girl would be her equal. But alas for resolutions! Mrs. Lancaster went with a number of retired naval officers and their families to the mountains for the summer, and life was very gay, and Frederick Ainsworth was not there. For the first few weeks Margaret struggled bravely with her resolve to study an hour each day. But as the days grew fuller of delightful engagements for mountain climbing and choice boating parties, she gradually gave up any attempt at work, assuring herself that "anybody would be too stupid to live who would try to study in the summer. It wasn't likely that Mag Jessup would have time to look into a book. She was probably shelling peas and picking over strawberries somewhere." But in this last idea she was mistaken. The truth was that Mag Jessup had more leisure than she had ever enjoyed in her life before. Mr. and Mrs. Duane went away by themselves to quiet places where Mrs. Duane could sketch and Mr. Duane could write on the historic work he was preparing, and Mag went with them. Beyond the looking after their rooms and doing the mending and repairing necessary after the clothes returned from the laundry, she had almost no duties, and was at liberty to sit out in the woods or under the trees in the arbor all day long if she chose, book in hand, so that she was near to be summoned for an errand on occasion. It seemed to be all that Mrs. Duane required. Not that any of them chose to sit at work all day. They took long walks into the wild and fascinating country, and did more mountain climbing of a rugged sort than Margaret Lancaster thought of. But on most such excursions it seemed to be the wish of both Mr. and Mrs. Duane to have little Mag with them. On these and other occasions they talked with her about the books she was studying in a way to increase her knowledge of and interest in them. The result of it all was that Mag returned to school in the fall much more vigorous in body and brain than she had been before, and showing very promptly in her recitations what the summer had done for her. Very early in the fall Margaret Lancaster gloomily recognized her as a formidable rival in history. She was also a rival in other ways. It would be difficult to explain, on paper, Margaret's annoyance when she found that her cousin Frederick not only remembered Mag as the little girl at Mrs. Perkins's boarding house, but continued to have a lively interest in her, and lavished his kindnesses upon her almost as freely as he did upon his cousin. She never ventured to refer to this but once. It was on a certain day when she was feeling particularly cross at Mag, because she had so manifestly excelled her in class. Her cousin Frederick had promised to take her for a sleigh ride in the park that afternoon, and he appeared at the door promptly at 4 o'clock, with a beaming face and a "Hurry up, Margaret, I have little Mag out there holding the ponies, and they feel more lively than she enjoys, I am afraid." Then did Margaret's face settle into a frown. "What in the world is she doing out there? John will come and hold your horses if you want them held. She hasn't turned hostler, has she, with all the rest?" "What are you talking about?" asked Frederick, affecting not to understand. "Mag is going with us, of course; and, being a plucky little woman, she has undertaken to look after the ponies while I wait for you. Be as quick as you can, Margaret, please." But Margaret was still on the lounge where she had flung herself at the first mention of Mag Jessup's name. "You need not wait for me, Frederick Ainsworth. If you think I keep company with servants and creatures of that sort, you are mistaken. When I go to the park, or anywhere else, in company with Mag Jessup, I shall be a good deal older than I am now." "Oh, come, Margie," said Frederick, in perfect good humor. "Don't be a dunce. Mag Jessup is your classmate, and the best scholar in the school, if some of the leading teachers are to be credited. One of these days it will be an honor to have known her as a schoolgirl, and to have taken rides with her to the park. Hurry up, we shall not have time for a spin around the park drive before father wants the horses, if you don't hasten." "When you take that girl back to her dining room and table waiting, where she belongs, or drop her in the river if you prefer, I will be ready to go with you, and not before." Margaret's eyes were flashing, and all her common sense was evidently gone. Her cousin's reference to Mag's scholarship had been too much for her. "Honestly?" asked Frederick, looking at her curiously. "Don't you mean to go, Margie? It is a splendid afternoon for driving, and the sleighing is prime. If you really mean it, I won't waste any more time; but I confess I did not think you were such a simpleton. Excuse the plain word, but, honestly, Margie, such absurd airs on your part call for plain language. Why, the Duanes, who have money enough to buy us all out, if money is a pass to society, and whose position in the world can not be questioned, couldn't be kinder to Mag if she were their own sister. Why shouldn't you give up that childish spite you used to have against her, and treat her as she deserves? She is a good girl and a smart one, and everybody knows it." If it had not been for the history class, I think Margaret would have yielded, but Frederick, in his ignorance, would put forward Mag's claim to scholarship, and the poor girl could not bear it. "Go away," she said with an angry wave of her hand in dismissal. "I don't want to see or hear any more of either of you." "All right," said Frederick promptly, and he closed the door and went away whistling "Away Down South in Dixie." Margaret raised herself sufficiently to see the ponies spring away with her cousin and "that hateful Mag Jessup," as she had begun to call her. Then she buried her head in the lounge pillow and cried. These and several like experiences served to increase the poor girl's silly prejudices, until by the mid-year she was ready to own to herself that she all but hated Mag Jessup. Mag, on her part, had as little to do with this particular schoolmate as possible, and, as far as she could, forgot her existence. She was very busy and very happy. Most of the girls in school had decided to treat her kindly. Many of them were quite friendly, and others simply left her pleasantly alone. The Duane girls were not there that winter, and Mag missed them, but, as has been said, she was really too busy to think much about companionship. I don't think it even occurred to her to notice that she was not invited out to any of the gatherings of the young people. When one day she actually received an invitation to an evening gathering at Mary Condit's home, she opened her eyes wide with astonishment, and felt half afraid, and was sorry that the invitation had come. The Condits were old acquaintances of Mrs. Duane, and Mary was one of the older girls in Mrs. Garland's school, and one who had been kind to Mag from the first. Mag went to the party because Mrs. Duane advised it. She was frightened at the thought, and felt sure she should rejoice when the evening was over; but to her surprise she enjoyed it. Kate Perkins was there, and renewed her acquaintance with Mag in a very friendly manner, and most of the girls were cordial to her. Moreover, Frederick Ainsworth was present, and saw to it that Mag had not a moment in which to feel left out and deserted. In thinking of it all, afterwards, Mag said, as she had said 100 times before, "How good and kind he is, not a bit like anybody else." Though what she meant by that last it might have been hard for her to have explained, as there were certainly several people who were uniformly good and kind to her. One little experience connected with the party had its pleasant and unpleasant side. They were studying, a group of them, a very old engraving on the library wall, and a discussion arose as to what period it represented. Several different views were brought forth and argued, until at length one of the schoolgirls said, "Ask Mag Jessup, she is sure to know." Whereupon Mag offered a suggestion unlike any of the others, and sustained her views against earnest opposition, until at last the owner of the picture was appealed to, and pronounced her right. "I told you she would know," said the little girl triumphantly, who had first called upon her. Then Margaret Lancaster, quite loud enough for Mag to overhear, said, "Of course she would know. She sits up nights and snatches all spare minutes between table waiting and errand running to cram dates into her brain, and is as proud of it as ever a peacock was of his tail. If I had my living to earn, I would try to give myself more useful study than the piling up of a lot of dates that nobody cares for." Mag tossed about on her bed that night, unable to sleep for thinking of this speech. Was it true that she was proud of her knowledge of history? Did she appear like a peacock to others as well as to Margaret Lancaster? It made her cheeks burn to think of it. Underneath was another thought. Was she learning to like Margaret less and less? How could she help it when the girl was steadily and increasingly disagreeable to her? But she must help it. If Margaret were determined to be her enemy, then her duty was plain, and had been settled long ago. What was there she could do to make herself really love that girl? If there was only something she could do to help her! But all such opportunities were past, and would not be likely to come to her again. Are these unusual thoughts for a young girl to bring home from a party? Does not that depend upon what the young girl's life is? Suppose she belongs to those who are steadily trying to obey the direction, "Whether ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Exact Truth. At last arrived the eventful day in which 9 young ladies, contestants for the $50 grand prize, were to read their respective papers before the assembled teachers and pupils of Mrs. Garland's school. The day was given up to it, and although no visitors were admitted, the rooms and the girls themselves were in festive dress, and as much honor was bestowed upon the readers as possible. In truth, some of the scholars made so much of the matter of toilet that more than once Mrs. Garland had been known to say, with a significant smile, words something like these: "My dear, I am trying to think what you will wear to honor your graduation day." Margaret Lancaster, especially, was splendid in ribbons and flowers. Mag Jessup, whose name was called next to hers, looked like a small brown robin beside her. Mag's neat brown dress, a trifle finer than she wore for every day, and brightened by a few scarlet ribbons, received an approving smile from Mrs. Garland. Just as the exercises were about to commence, a messenger came with a magnificent bouquet of blush roses. There was a general subdued exclamation over their beauty, and Mrs. Garland, not attempting to suppress it, smiled as she turned the card and read aloud the name. Margaret Kane Jessup, with best wishes for the day. Your friend has done what he could to make you the envy of us all, she said genially to Mag, who had come forward to receive her gift, her cheeks almost rivaling the roses. She did not need to look at the name on the card to be sure that it was Frederick Ainsworth who had been so kind. How good he was! Yes, and how naughty, I am afraid. He wanted Mag to have the flowers, and he wanted above all things to further impress his cousin Margaret with her silliness in the stand she had taken against Mag. That his gift would be sure to increase the ill feeling Margaret already had, he did not stop to consider. The midday recess had come and passed, and some of the roses were drooping, and some of the scholars were yawning wearily, before either of the Margarets were called upon. At last a general wave of renewed interest seemed to pass over the room as Margaret Lancaster's name was heard. The sleepy girls sat more erect and with brightened faces. Margaret was sure to have something worth listening to. Her story was certainly worthy of commendation. Some of her listeners paid her the compliment of forgetting that she was reading a trial essay. They forgot all about her, indeed, and gave themselves up to the enjoyment of her story. "Wasn't that splendid?" murmured one or two of her admirers, as she took her seat. "And so beautifully read. She ought to take the prize." "She is the best one yet, decidedly." "Yes, and there are only two more." "Ah, but one of them is Mag Jessup." Comments like these surged through the room during the 5 minutes' respite. Then came Alice Powell, whose paper was substantial and sensible. "And stupid," added one of the younger girls in a semi-whisper. And the secretary called, "Miss Margaret Kane Jessup." When Mag had concluded her paper, I don't think there was a dissenting opinion in the room. Even Margaret Lancaster, had she been strictly honest, would have been compelled to admit that Mag had held the interest of her audience from almost the first moment of her reading in an unusual manner. The truth was that Mag had been so deeply interested in her own plot as almost to forget that her effort had anything to do with a prize. And she read very much as she would have told a story that thrilled her. The committee of teachers retired to the library immediately after the reading of this paper, and the buzz of undertone conversation filled the room while they waited. Mag sat apart and did not attempt to talk with any one. Now that the excitement of the reading was over, she felt tired and frightened. It seemed to her that her story was very silly, and that Mrs. Garland must be ashamed of her. She could even take no pleasure in her roses, because Mr. Frederick had made her promise to read that silly thing to him, and he would see how entirely unworthy of roses it was. She stole a glance once or twice at Margaret Lancaster, and wondered that she did not look happier. She must be almost certain of the prize. Yet her face had a look on it that made poor Mag shiver. She was talking hard and fast with two of the girls who were especially intimate with her, and much under her control. Then the committee returned. What a very few minutes they had been away! They must have known before they went out just what they would do. The room was very still, waiting for their report, and certainly there was much astonishment over it. Honorable mention was made of Miss Margaret Lancaster. Indeed, the chairman admitted that there had been some discussion over her name, but they had finally agreed unanimously to propose the names of Margaret Kane Jessup and Alice Stuart Powell. And Margaret Lancaster was actually left out! Very many were surprised over this. The younger portion of the school had not imagined that Alice Powell had any chance beside her. As for little Mag, her head seemed to be spinning about the room, and for a moment she could hardly see. Such genuine surprise took possession of her. But yesterday she had thought, "What if I should really get the prize and be able to buy some books of my own?" But this morning she had lost all faith in her story, and expected nothing. A very general and, on the whole, hearty clapping of hands greeted the report, but a few of the scholars did not join. At last Mrs. Garland's voice was heard in congratulation. She heartily approved of the committee's decision, and she added a few choice words of commendation for Mag's story, which set the young girl's heart to throbbing as even the report had not done. Every girl in school appreciated commendation from Mrs. Garland. And then the school was treated to a sensation the like of which no scholar remembered. It was Margaret Lancaster's voice, distinct and angry, that created an instant hush, while those in the back seats leaned forward to lose no syllable of what was being said. "Mrs. Garland, some of us did not know that you allowed copious quotations, or we might have earned a little glory also." "Quotations?" repeated Mrs. Garland, in great surprise. "Unacknowledged quotations, do you mean, Miss Lancaster?" "Certainly I do." "Then your remark is not understood. Since you have chosen to make it before the entire school, you may explain your meaning." "I mean that Mag Jessup's story, of which you seem to think so highly, is copied from a book." Utmost excitement prevailed at once. "What a shame!" said one voice distinctly. "I think as much," said another. "I don't believe a word of it," exclaimed a third. "Silence!" said Mrs. Garland in a clear, cold voice. "Young ladies, the privilege of conversing together is withdrawn. Miss Morton will be kind enough to come to the platform. Miss Lancaster and Miss Jessup, I will see you at once in my office." Miss Morton, the mathematical teacher, came at once to the chair and set the school at work. Though she could not have expected very clear replies to questions in mental arithmetic, with the thoughts of every scholar behind those closed office doors. How shall I try to describe the feelings of little Mag Jessup as she waited with tightly clasped hands that would tremble with excitement in spite of her, while Mrs. Garland questioned her accuser? The idea that she would do such a despicable thing as steal part of her story! She, who had refused a suggestion that Mr. Duane had made, and several hints that Mr. Frederick had kindly given her, because, although they were splendid, they were not her own, and she had no right to profit by them. Mr. Frederick had argued the point with her, had assured her that she was over-particular, and that before she began to write she was quite at liberty to make use of all such general suggestions; that they had nothing to do with the actual work which her paper was expected to represent. But Mag, though disliking to appear ungrateful and obstinate, had yet held steadily to her determination to take not a hint of help from anybody, and this was her reward! "Take that chair, Miss Jessup," commanded Mrs. Garland, not unkindly, and she pointed her pupil to an easy chair near the window. Perhaps she saw that the poor girl could hardly stand. Then she turned to Margaret. "Now, Miss Lancaster, repeat and explain your extraordinary statement, which, whatever you may mean by it, would have been very much better made to me in private." "I don't see anything to explain," said Margaret sullenly. "I said she stole her story, that every one is making such a fuss about, and so she did." "You know that is not true," burst from poor Mag's white lips. She felt that it would be impossible to hear such words and not say so much. Then Mrs. Garland's voice. "Hush, my dear, I am conducting this examination. Miss Lancaster, what reason have you for thinking so?" "The very best reasons in the world." "Very well, state them as briefly as possible." "It is all in an old book of ours." Mag started to her feet with an exclamation, then at a warning glance from Mrs. Garland sat down again and clasped her hands so tightly that the print of the nails showed for several days. "Be explicit, Miss Lancaster. Do I understand you that a portion of Miss Jessup's paper you believe to be like something in a book of yours?" "All of it," said Margaret firmly. "Every single word." And now Mag's face, that had been crimson, began to pale. This astounding statement all but took her breath away. What could the girl mean? Was it possible that she could have written something much like what someone else wrote years ago? Did people ever do such things? If they did, and this was an instance, how could she ever make Mrs. Garland, or for that matter the Duanes, or Mr. Frederick himself, believe that she had never seen nor heard of the book, and that she had thought out every word for herself. "Oh, Mrs. Garland!" she burst forth, and Mrs. Garland lifted her hand. "My dear, I must insist upon your allowing me to manage this whole matter in my own way. Miss Lancaster, do you realize what you are saying? Are you prepared to stand by the statement you have made, that there is a certain old book in your father's library that contains every word of Miss Jessup's paper, which she has read before the school to-day?" A look of sullen defiance overspread Margaret's face as she answered haughtily: "I am in the habit of being believed, Mrs. Garland. That is what I said." "Very well, then you are of course ready to prove it. I shall ask you to take a carriage from the stand at the corner and go at once to your home for the book, returning here as quickly as possible with it. Miss Jessup and I will wait here until you return." For a single instant Margaret hesitated and seemed half frightened. Then she said angrily: "I do not see the need for putting everybody to so much trouble. I told you I was in the habit of being believed. What I say I mean." "Pardon me, Miss Lancaster, for reminding you that your opinion as to how I shall manage this matter has not been asked. I must be allowed to do as I think best. It is a very grave charge indeed against one of my pupils who is also in the habit of being believed. The very least we can do, when we make a charge against a person, is to bring undeniable proof that we are not mistaken." "Mag hasn't denied it." Mrs. Garland was for a moment startled by this statement. It was undoubtedly true that, beyond her first excited exclamation, Mag had been quite silent concerning the charges. Still, that was probably because she herself had directed her to be silent. But Margaret's words reminded her that she had not asked her whether there was any shadow of truth in the charge against her. She had taken it for granted that there was not. At this point she looked toward the small brown figure sunken in the depths of her easy-chair, and said: "Miss Jessup, I have not formally asked you if you wrote your paper without assistance or quotations. I do it now as a matter of form. Is every sentence in your paper your own composition?" I thought so," said poor Mag, hesitating and blushing violently. Certainly it was the worst answer she could have made. For the moment Mrs. Garland's perfect faith in her was staggered, and Margaret Lancaster was triumphant. "There!" she said, "you see that she does not deny it. She knows, of course, that what I am saying is true. I suppose that at least you will take her word and save me from going after the old book in our attic." By this time Mag was crying so violently that she could not speak, and Mrs. Garland, looking at her with a troubled expression such as seldom appeared on her face, still spoke coldly to her other pupil. "Miss Lancaster, I will try to overlook your insolence to me, on the ground that you are probably very much excited. You may carry out my directions at once, and I will await your return. Or stay, perhaps I should not send a young lady alone in a public carriage. I will have you attended." Her hand was on the bell as she spoke, and in another moment one of the teachers had been requested to call a carriage and accompany Miss Lancaster to her home on an errand, and return with her. There was nothing left for Margaret but obedience. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed, during which Mrs. Garland left her pupil to herself. Then, seeing she had gained self-control, she asked a single question. "My dear, if you are willing, I should like to have you tell me what your singular reply meant a few minutes ago. Surely you know whether your work is your own." She remembered long afterward the mournful eyes that were turned toward her as Mag said: "How can I know? If she has a book that has it in, somebody must have written it before I did. Are not such things possible, Mrs. Garland? Of course, I believed that I was writing what no one else had ever written. I thought every word of it was true. But if it is in a book, how can I help it? And how can I make anybody but God believe that I am honest and true?" Mrs. Garland arose, came over to her pupil, and, bending down, kissed her forehead lightly as she said: "I believe in you, my dear girl, and I shall continue to do so, however suspicious the plot against you may be. I shall believe that what you say about it is the exact truth. Little Mag has received many precious kisses since that hour, but perhaps none that stole into her heart with such healing balm as that. 5 minutes afterward the door opened and Margaret Lancaster entered bearing in her arms a very large old book, with one cover and the fly leaves torn away. "There," she said, flinging it down on the table. "You will find that I have told the exact truth. Every single word of her wonderful story is in that book." She was right. It was a copy of Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What else could one do? It was Margaret Lancaster's turn to cry. More bitter tears than her old schoolmate, Mag Jessup, had ever shed were following each other slowly down her cheeks. The first agony of grief and surprise and terrible disappointment were past, and she was now too worn out to do other than cry quietly. The old housekeeper, who had known her from childhood, was moving softly about the room, setting a chair straight now and then, or picking up a mislaid book, more from the habit of being busy than because there was really anything to be done. She looked pitifully now and again at the young girl over on the couch among the cushions, and at last she attempted awkwardly a word of comfort. "I wouldn't cry any more if I were you, Miss Margie. It doesn't do any good. Not after people have shed as many tears as you have. You are all tired out." "What difference does that make? There is nobody to care any more whether I am tired or not." This thought brought a fresh burst of tears, yet it was so true that the literal woman who heard it could only shake her gray head and murmur in half undertone, "Poor young thing! It is hard, I am sure. Nobody can blame her for going on so, and she expected it all to be so different." Perhaps that was one of the bitterest drops in poor Margaret's cup of sorrow, that it was all so utterly different from any form of trouble that she had imagined could come to her. She went over it all in memory for the 100th time, as she lay there with closed eyes through which the slow tears constantly forced themselves. That morning, only 6 weeks ago, when she was going downstairs dressed for a walk, dressed in the most perfect of winter costumes, costly furs, and handsome gloves, and nodding plumes, all of exactly the right shade and shape, looking faultlessly elegant. Margaret Lancaster, the young lady who had the year before graduated with honor from Mrs. Garland's school, and learned better than to overdress her handsome body, and was a model of propriety in all things that belonged to the fashionable world. She had been unusually happy that morning, she remembered. First, because her new suit fitted perfectly, and was unusually becoming, and secondly, because that very morning her mother had consented to go abroad again soon after the holidays. As she reached the lower hall she had just planned what her traveling suit should be. Then the doorbell had rung, and she had waited in the breakfast room to see whether that need interest her. She had heard the word telegram, and had rushed out to see about it, not frightened, but interested. It might be about the creams she had ordered for the evening, or a message from her friend Nettie to meet her downtown somewhere. Telegrams and telephone messages were common enough. Ah, but this had been one of those terribly common ones, such as shoot over the wires somewhere every minute of every day, carrying with them misery that lasts. "It's important, lady," the messenger had said, and something in his tone had startled her and made her carry the yellow envelope to her mother instead of sending it by the maid. In 2 minutes more she knew that she was fatherless. It was a terrible blow to the girl. She had loved her father, not only, but had been extravagantly proud of his position and influence. Some of the most rose-colored dreams of her successful future had had to do with persons and places that her father's position would make possible for her to see. In all her plannings she had not for a moment thought of the possibility of death. For 3 wretched days she gave way to the violence of utterly uncontrolled grief, sure that life would have no heavier blow for her. Then one evening the family physician roused and frightened her by the announcement that he was seriously anxious concerning her mother, who had not rallied from the effects of the nervous shock as he had hoped she might, and he considered her situation critical. Margaret's love for her mother was the most unselfish feeling that she had cultivated in her selfish life. She really, for a few days, forgot herself, and became her mother's devoted attendant, never for a moment allowing herself to think that the poor, frail lady was seriously ill. She assured all the friends who hurried to offer sympathy and condolence that "Mamma was prostrated by the shock, but was slowly gaining." She believed so, poor girl, deaf alike to the doctor's opinion and to the mother's own belief, until, only 10 days from the hour that the news of her father's death reached her, people passed the house with quiet little step, and spoke low as they said, "Poor Margaret Lancaster! Father and mother both gone in so short a time." This last blow seemed for a time almost to stupefy Margaret. She shed less violent tears than she had over her father's death, but she refused to eat, or to take exercise, or even to try in a rational way to sleep. She spent her days and nights in her mother's room, declined to see any of her acquaintances, and in short seemed almost anxious to have done with this life as soon as possible. "She needs another shock to arouse her to action," said the troubled physician. "If something does not happen soon to change the current of her thoughts, she will follow her father and mother." The shock was nearer than any of them imagined. One morning Margaret's aunt, Mrs. Schuyler, who had come on at once when the telegram announcing her brother-in-law's death was received, and who had been with Margaret during all the trying weeks that followed, was summoned to a private conference with Admiral Lancaster's confidential lawyer. From him she went to see the family physician. She came home late and went directly to her room, sending word to Margaret that she was so utterly tired out that she must excuse her for the night. But she did not at once retire. Instead, she slipped on a warm wrapper and sat in her easy-chair before the grate for hours, thinking and occasionally crying. She had a heavy task before her for the next day, and dreaded it. The morning following this night vigil was the one in which Margaret lay among the cushions with the housekeeper for company. It was just as the housekeeper had tried in vain to cheer her that Mrs. Schuyler entered the room. "How do you feel this morning, my dear?" she said kindly. "No different, auntie. There is nothing to make any difference with me any more, you know." Margaret had already brushed away the tears, and as she turned her great mournful eyes with heavy black rings under them toward her aunt, it was plainly to be seen that this utter abandonment to grief was wearing heavily upon the young girl. Still, Mrs. Schuyler was more than doubtful of the physician's prescription for rousing her. "It will kill her," she said to herself, as she looked at the haggard face. "I am just afraid it will kill her, but what can I do? I am under orders, and of course she must know the whole now." "My dear," she said, hesitatingly, "I hope you did not miss me too much yesterday. I was obliged to be absent such a long time. I was with Mr. Sumner, you know. Do you feel able to listen to a little business this morning?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't ever want to hear anything about it," she said. "I am like poor mamma. I neither understand business nor care anything for it. Fix everything exactly as you please." "But, my dear Margie, that will not do. You will be of age in a few months, you know, and there are matters that it is absolutely necessary for you to think about. Mr. Sumner thinks you should be told at once, and so, for that matter, does Dr. Ledwith." Margaret's eyes seemed to open wider. "I do not see why," she said wearily. "Surely it is not Dr. Ledwith's business. So long as I swallow his tonics and nervines and other stuffs he ought to be content. Even if I do not swallow them, his bill will be paid all the same. Why cannot Mr. Sumner manage just as he has always done, and not torment me? It is about money, I suppose, and what do I know of money except to have some when I want it?" "My child, you must remember that you are not a little girl any more. Every woman has to know more or less about business matters. And there is much more than money involved. Oh, my poor dear, I don't know how to tell you. I wish they had chosen somebody else." The slightest show of curiosity appeared in Margaret's eyes. She drew herself partly up from the pillows as she said, "What is there to tell, auntie? I can't think of anything important enough now to fuss over. The worst has happened to me, and nothing else matters. Has Mr. Sumner lost some of the money?" "There have been heavy losses, Margie. Mr. Sumner has known about them for years, but my poor brother hoped to recover some of the loss. Mr. Sumner says there is no hope of it. However, that is not the serious matter, dear. There is enough, much more than I wish there were, as matters stand. Margie, did my sister ever hint to you anything about the time when you were a little bit of a girl?" "We never talked very much about my early childhood. I asked her once to show me some of the things I wore when I was a baby, and she said she had none of them. I remember I scolded her a little for not keeping them. I told her I thought mothers always kept the clothes of their only child. Why do you ask me that?" "Because, my dear, I have a heavy task before me. I hoped I could prepare you a little for it, but I find I do not know how. I believe the humane way will be to tell you at once. Had you ever a hint from anyone that you were an adopted child?" "Never!" Margaret sat erect now, and her eyes began to glow. "I never heard or dreamed of such a thing. Of course I am Admiral Lancaster's daughter. Auntie, what do you mean?" "My poor darling, you were just as dear to my sister and her husband as though you were their very own. I am sure of that. And they never meant you to know. But now it has become necessary. They took you to their home and hearts, Margie, when you were a little bit of a girl. I remember as if it were but yesterday. How astonished I was when my sister wrote me about you, and what a cunning little creature you were, the first time I saw you." She talked on rapidly, trying to stem the stream of questions she saw in Margaret's eyes, trying to cover her own intense embarrassment and pain by dwelling on trifling details. At last Margaret interrupted her. "Not their own child! Then I have had no father and mother all these years! Everybody has deceived me! It can't be possible!" But Mrs. Schuyler's sensitive nature was struck by these words, and she said what was perhaps the best she could say to help the girl to self-control. "Margaret, I know you are suffering, and allowance must be made for you. But even now, is deceived the word to use toward people who took you, a homeless, friendless little child, and during all these years have lavished upon you all the love and care that real parents could give? It certainly does seem to me that even at this time you have many mercies to remember." It was hours later that Margaret asked the question which Mrs. Schuyler had been fearing. "If I am not Margaret Lancaster, who am I? What name have I a right to?" "Margaret, my brother-in-law fully meant to give you a legal right to his name. He thought of you always as his daughter. I never knew until yesterday that the legal forms had been neglected." "Then I am a beggar! Well, what is my name? I insist upon knowing now all that there is to know." "Margie, I never knew myself until last night. We often talked about you in those early years, but it happened that while I knew all the circumstances, I did not hear your name. Of late years you were so entirely her own that my sister never mentioned any of these things. I think she had even forgotten the name herself." "What is the name?" The old imperious tone that belonged naturally to the girl whom Mrs. Schuyler had known as Margaret Lancaster was distinct enough. The question could not be parried longer. Your name was Jessup," she faltered. "Susan Jessup. My sister did not like the name, Susan, so she changed it very soon to Margaret, her mother's name." "Jessup!" repeated Margaret, in a tone that Mrs. Schuyler could not forget. "Susan Jessup! And that Mag Jessup who has always been well, never mind that. Is she any connection of mine?" "She is your sister, my dear. and a better educated or finer looking sister one could not very well have. You must not blame me, Margaret. I assure you, all this is hard for me, too. I never expected to have to tell it. I learned the particulars only yesterday. It seems that my brother kept all the papers. He meant to use them, of course, in having the necessary legal papers made out, but he neglected it, that was all. Your own mother, my dear, was a very worthy woman, poor and unfortunate, but in every way worthy of respect. There is nothing about her memory to blush for. As for money, let that miserable nephew of my brother-in-law, who has been mean enough to hunt this all out, and try to slip into property that was never intended for him, have the money. With your education you can be independent of other people's money." "Other people's money!" Her own father's wealth that by and by, when time had softened her grief, Margaret Lancaster had felt, despite the careless words she had spoken about it, would be a pleasant thing to have. And now she had not a penny! And Mag Jessup, her rival not only in the history prize, but throughout her school days, was her sister! She could not bear it! She would not! "Don't!" she said sharply, putting her hands to her ears to shut out Mrs. Schuyler's attempts at soothing. "Go away! I cannot bear another word! Let me alone! Don't let any one come near me! Not any one!" she added fiercely, as the remembrance that now she had a sister rushed over her. Mrs. Schuyler turned sadly away. She did not know what to do with this fierce girl. She had been roused, certainly, but it seemed more than doubtful that she would reach a sane and healthful state of mind. Margaret Lancaster, crushed and dependent, might be more easily dealt with than Margaret Lancaster roused to fierce obstinacy. On the evening of that same day two young people sat in the music room of Mr. Duane's house, and talked over this stricken girl's strange history, and the strange way in which their own lives had been suddenly linked with hers. "And to think that all these years she has been my sister!" Little Mag Jessup had uttered an exclamation somewhat like this several times before. She could not get away from the strangeness of it. Mr. Ainsworth smiled indulgently. "That feature of the situation impresses you most," he said. "Yes, how can I help it? I have grown up thinking that I had no sister, though I distinctly remember our little Susie, and the idea carefully taught me that I was always to take care of her." "Then your way is quite clear, I hope, if she will consent to it?" Little Mag looked down at the heavy gold loop she wore on her third finger, and was silent for some seconds. "Are you sure that you want it?" she asked at last. "I am sure that I want whatever best pleases you; and my first interest in you was strangely deepened by the discovery that you accepted, without argument, any situation that you believed to be right." "Of course," said Mag. "What else could one do?" Over this question Mr. Frederick laughed softly. "I think I know several people who have discovered a middle ground," he said. A week afterwards they sat together, the two Margarets, one of them in deep mourning, and with a face out of which all the brightness had gone, yet it was a quieter face than some of her friends had expected to see. Margaret Lancaster was learning self-control at last. "It all seems so strange," she said, mournfully. "The idea of you, Mag Jessup, offering me a home! Do you remember I told you once that I presumed you would always be a servant?" She laughed a little bitterly over the memory. "Yes," said Mag softly, "and I always shall be, a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ." "I haven't even a right to my name," burst forth Margaret again. "I can never get acquainted with myself as Susan Jessup, but I have no right to be Margaret Lancaster." "Indeed you have," said Mag very earnestly. "Do not for a moment believe otherwise. The mother who loved you and cared for you and was everything to you for so many years had a right to name you, and you were and are her daughter Margaret. It is not my name. My best and dearest friends know me as little Mag. I couldn't be called Margaret, and you couldn't be called anything else. But, Margaret, I have been motherless nearly all my life, and alone. I am truly glad to have found a sister. I shall love you very much, and I think you can love me a little after a while when you get used to me." Margaret Lancaster laughed outright. "I remember that, too," she said. "You told me, that summer when we were in the country, that you loved me. I didn't believe it then, but I do now. You were always a good little thing. It is strange that I disliked you so much. I shouldn't have done so if you hadn't been a better scholar in history than I. That seemed too absurd. I wonder you do not hate me, and I wonder that Cousin Fred doesn't. I have given you both reason enough. He isn't my Cousin Fred, is he? Mr. Frederick, you used to say, and I laughed at you for it. I couldn't call him that. I am glad I have no need. My respected brother-in-law that is to be! How bewildering it all is! But you are both good. You have been the only people who had any sense during this awful time. I think I shall love you, Mag Jessup, and I like the thought of having Fred for a brother." End of Project Gutenberg's Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy.